The city never truly slept. It only hid its secrets beneath layers of silence. Asterisk welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly. Let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The streetlights cast their amber glow across empty pavements, each pool of light separated by stretches of comfortable darkness. In this hour between midnight and dawn, the city transformed itself into something quieter, more contemplative. The rush and noise of daytime commerce had faded, leaving behind only the essential sounds, the distant hum of traffic lights, cycling through their colors for no one in particular, the soft whisper of wind moving through alleyways, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a delivery truck making its solitary rounds. On Maple Street, the old police station stood like a lighthouse in this sea of urban quiet. Built in 1947, its red brick facade had weathered decades of seasons, each winter and summer leaving their mark in subtle ways. The mortar between the bricks had darkened with age, and the concrete steps leading to the main entrance bore the smooth wear patterns of countless footsteps, each one part of a story that had played out within these walls. Inside, the building held a different kind of silence. It was the silence of accumulated time, of stories that had been told and retold until they settled into the very structure of the place. The floors, covered in that particular shade of institutional green linoleum that seemed to exist nowhere else in the world, stretched down corridors lit by fluorescent fixtures that hummed almost inaudibly. Some of the bulbs flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows that moved like memories across the walls. The archives occupied the entire basement level of the building. Row upon row of metal filing cabinets stood in perfect alignment, each one labeled with years that stretched back to the station's founding. The air down here carried the scent of old paper and manila folders, mixed with the faint metallic smell of the filing cabinet hardware. It was not unpleasant, this atmosphere. Rather, it felt like a library of human experience, cataloged and preserved in the careful handwriting of officers who had long since retired or passed away. Detective Margaret Chun had often found herself drawn to these archives during the quiet hours of her night shifts, not because she was working on any particular case, but because the space itself seemed to invite contemplation. The overhead lights were softer here, casting fewer shadows, and the sound of her footsteps was muffled by the close proximity of all those files, all those documented moments of human experience. Tonight, she moved slowly between the rows, her fingers occasionally trailing along the edges of the filing cabinets. Each drawer contained dozens of folders, and each folder contained a story that had once demanded immediate attention, urgent action, careful investigation. Now they rested here in organized peace, their emergency transformed into history, their urgency mellowed into memory. File 195-20847 contained the report of a burglary that had taken place on Elm Street in the early hours of September 15th. The investigating officer, Sergeant Robert Hayes, had documented the scene with methodical precision. The front door of the residence had been forced, the lock mechanism damaged but not completely destroyed. In the living room, a small ceramic figurine collection had been disturbed, with 3 pieces missing. The homeowner, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, had noticed that her jewelry box had been opened. Though only a single gold bracelet had been taken, what struck Detective Chun as she read through the report was not the crime itself, but the careful attention Officer Hayes had paid to details that seemed peripheral to the investigation. He had noted that the intruder had closed the front door behind them when they left. He had observed that the kitchen window, though unlatched, showed no signs of entry or exit. Most memorably, he had written that the homeowner's cat, a tabby named Winston, had been found sleeping peacefully on the sofa, undisturbed by whatever had transpired in the night. The case had been closed within a month. The missing items were never recovered, but no additional incidents were reported in the neighborhood. Officer Hayes had concluded his final report with a simple statement: investigation complete. No further leads available. But Detective Chun could sense, even across the decades, that there had been more to the story. Some understanding that Hayes had reached, but hadn't felt necessary to document in official language. She replaced the file and moved to another cabinet, this one containing records from 1963. Here, the paperwork had a different character. The forms were slightly different, the language more formal, the typing less precise. These were the files from the era of manual typewriters and carbon copies, when each report was a physical act of creation, requiring patience and care. File 1963-1205 detailed an incident that had occurred on a snowy December evening. A man named Thomas Morrison had reported that his car had been stolen from the parking lot of Brennan's Diner on Route 9. The vehicle was a 1959 Chevrolet Impala, dark blue, with a small dent on the passenger side door and a loose radio knob. The investigating officer, Lieutenant David Walsh, had interviewed Mr. Morrison extensively about the circumstances of the theft. According to Morrison's statement, he had parked the car at approximately 7:30 p.m. and had gone inside the diner to have coffee and pie. He had been meeting an old friend from military service, and their conversation had extended longer than expected. When he emerged from the diner at 10:15 p.m., the parking lot was nearly empty, and his car was nowhere to be seen. What made this case memorable was not its resolution, but its lack of one. The car was never found. No witnesses came forward. No similar thefts were reported in the area. Lieutenant Walsh had conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing diner staff, checking with local garages and scrap dealers, even following up with Morrison's friend to verify the timeline of their meeting. But the Chevrolet Impala had simply vanished into the December night, leaving behind only this carefully documented record of its disappearance. Detective Chun found herself wondering about that car, sometimes during her quiet moments in the archives. Had it been stripped for parts in some distant garage? Had it been repainted and sold far from town? Or was it possible that it still existed somewhere, decades later, carrying with it the story of that snowy evening when its owner had lingered too long over coffee and conversation? The archives held thousands of such stories, each one a small mystery wrapped in routine paperwork. There were reports of vandalism that consisted of nothing more than a single broken window. There were files documenting noise complaints that had been resolved with a simple conversation between neighbors. There were incident reports describing property damage that amounted to a few dollars, but which had been important enough to someone to justify an official report. File 19780333 contained the documentation of what the reporting officer had classified as suspicious activity. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, who lived on Birch Street, had called the police to report that someone had been leaving small bouquets of flowers on her front porch every Tuesday morning for 3 weeks. The flowers were always the same, 3 white roses wrapped in brown paper, with no note or identification. Officer Janet Torres had responded to the call and had conducted what she described as a neighborhood canvass. She had spoken with residents on both sides of Mrs. Kim's house and across the street. No one had witnessed the flower deliveries. The local florist confirmed that he had not received any orders for weekly white rose deliveries to that address. Officer Torres had advised Mrs. Kim to contact the station if the pattern continued, or if she felt threatened in any way. According to a follow-up report filed 2 weeks later, the flower deliveries had stopped as mysteriously as they had begun. Mrs. Kim had called to inform the police that no flowers had appeared the previous Tuesday, and none appeared the Tuesday after that. The case was closed with a notation that no crime had been committed and no further action was required. But Detective Chen found herself drawn to this file whenever she encountered it in her late-night browsing. There was something beautiful about the mystery of those anonymous flowers, something that spoke to a gentler kind of human story than what usually filled police reports. Someone in the neighborhood had wanted to brighten Mrs. Kim's Tuesday mornings, and they had done so with such discretion that their identity remained forever unknown. It was a crime only in the sense that Mrs. Kim had felt unsettled by the kindness of strangers. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady song as Detective Chun moved deeper into the archives. These files from the late 1970s had a particular character that reflected their time. The reports were more detailed than those from earlier decades, but they still retained a certain formality, a respect for the weight of official documentation. The officers who had written these reports had understood that they were creating a permanent record, something that might be referenced years or even decades in the future. File 1979-0891 documented a case that had stretched across an entire summer. Beginning in June and continuing through August, residents of Sycamore Street had reported a series of minor thefts from their yards and gardens. Nothing valuable was ever taken, but small items would disappear: a ceramic garden gnome, a wooden wind chime, a small terracotta pot containing a spider plant, a decorative stepping stone shaped like a butterfly. The investigating officer, Detective Raymond Foster, had approached the case with methodical thoroughness. He had mapped out each reported theft, looking for patterns in timing, location, and the type of items taken. He had interviewed every resident on the street, asking not only about their own losses but about anything unusual they might have observed in the neighborhood. What emerged from Detective Foster's investigation was not a solution, but a deeper mystery. The thefts seemed to follow no logical pattern. They occurred at different times of day and on different days of the week. The items taken had no apparent connection to each other in terms of value, size, or utility. Most puzzling of all, several residents reported that they had found unfamiliar small objects in their yards: a hand-carved wooden bird, a painted seashell, a smooth river stone with a hole through its center. Detective Foster had theorized that the thefts and the mysterious appearances were connected, perhaps the work of someone who was collecting certain objects while leaving others as a form of trade or gift. But despite extensive investigation, including consultation with local mental health professionals about possible explanations for such behavior, no suspect was ever identified. The case remained officially open through the end of August, when the thefts suddenly stopped. Detective Foster's final report noted that no incidents had been reported for 2 weeks, and that the neighborhood appeared to have returned to normal. He had recommended that the case remain open pending any future developments, but no further incidents were ever reported. Years later, reading through Detective Foster's meticulous documentation, Detective Chun could appreciate the care with which he had approached what others might have dismissed as a series of minor nuisances. He had understood that these small disruptions had genuinely unsettled the residents of Sycamore Street, and he had treated their concerns with the same seriousness he would have applied to a major investigation. Archives held many such examples of conscientious police work applied to cases that would never make headlines or appear in crime statistics. These officers had understood that their role extended beyond catching criminals to include maintaining the peace and security that allowed communities to function. They had documented not just crimes, but the fears and concerns of citizens who trusted them enough to call when something didn't feel right in their neighborhoods. File 1981-1129 contained report that Detective Chun had read many times during her late-night visits to the archives. It concerned an incident that had taken place on Thanksgiving evening, when Officer Maria Santos had responded to a call about a disturbance at the old Riverside Cemetery. The caller, Mr. Edward Walsh, lived in a house that backed up to the cemetery grounds. He had been watching television after dinner when he noticed lights moving among the headstones. Not flashlight beams or car headlights, but what he described as soft, steady lights like candles, but brighter. Officer Santos had arrived at the cemetery at 9:45 p.m. to find the grounds empty and quiet. Her initial search with a flashlight revealed nothing unusual. The headstones stood in their orderly rows, some dating back to the 1800s, others more recent. The trees that provided shade during the day cast long shadows in the moonlight, but there were no signs of recent activity. However, as Officer Santos was preparing to leave, she noticed something that she documented carefully in her report. On approximately a dozen graves scattered throughout the cemetery, someone had left small offerings: a few wildflowers, a smooth stone, a small American flag, a child's toy car. The items appeared to have been placed recently. As they showed no signs of weather damage, Officer Santos had contacted the cemetery caretaker, who confirmed that these offerings had not been there during his afternoon rounds. The caretaker also mentioned that similar offerings had been discovered periodically over the past few months, always on holidays or significant dates. Halloween had seen small pumpkins and autumn leaves. Veterans Day had brought tiny American flags and handwritten notes. The case was classified as a non-criminal incident, as no damage had been done and no cemetery rules had been violated. Officer Santos had concluded her report with the observation that someone in the community was paying respects to graves that might otherwise go unvisited, ensuring that even the oldest burials received some acknowledgement on important days. Detective Chun found this report particularly moving because it captured something essential about the relationship between the living and the dead, between memory and forgetting. Someone had taken it upon themselves to tend to the forgotten graves, to ensure that holidays were marked even in the cemeteries. Oldest sections where the names on the headstones were no longer familiar to anyone in town. The cemetery itself had become a repository of the community's history, much like the police archives. Each headstone marked not just a death, but a life that had been lived in this place, among these streets and neighborhoods that still existed. The person leaving those small offerings understood this connection between past and present, and they had chosen to honor it in the most direct way possible. As Detective Chun moved through the files from the 1980s, she noticed how the nature of police work had begun to change. The reports from this decade were longer, more detailed, reflecting new procedures and protocols that had been developed to address an increasingly complex society. But the essence of the work remained the same: officers responding to citizens' concerns, documenting incidents both large and small, maintaining the thin thread of security that allowed communities to function. File 19850654 detailed an investigation into a series of anonymous letters that had been sent to various residents of Oakwood Drive. The letters were not threatening or hostile, but they had nevertheless caused considerable concern in the neighborhood. Each letter contained detailed observations about the recipient's daily routines, written in a tone that was more curious than menacing. One letter, sent to Mrs. Alice Henderson, noted that she always watered her garden at exactly 6:30 a.m., that she preferred pink petunias to red ones, and that her cat, Mittens, had a habit of watching birds from the front window between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m. every day. Another letter, received by Mr. James Park, commented on his practice of reading the newspaper on his front porch every Sunday morning, and mentioned that he always spent extra time on the sports section. Detective Lisa Wong, who had been assigned to investigate the letters, had approached the case with characteristic thoroughness. She had analyzed the handwriting, the paper, even the ink used in the letters. She had interviewed each recipient extensively, looking for connections between them that might explain why they had been selected. She had also conducted surveillance of Oakwood Drive during various times of day, hoping to identify someone who was in a position to observe the detailed behaviors described in the letters. What Detective Wong discovered was that the letters were being written by Mrs. Eleanor Graff, a 78-year-old widow who lived at the end of Oakwood Drive. Mrs. Graff spent most of her days sitting by her front window, and over the years, she had developed an intimate knowledge of her neighbors' routines and habits. The letters were her way of reaching out, of letting people know that someone was paying attention to their daily lives. When Detective Wong interviewed Mrs. Graff, she found a lonely woman who missed the sense of community that had existed in the neighborhood when she was younger. She had written the letters not to frighten anyone, but to establish some form of connection with neighbors she rarely had occasion to speak with. She had included such specific observations to show that someone cared enough to notice the small details of their lives. The resolution of the case was handled with great sensitivity. Detective Wong had arranged a meeting between Mrs. Graff and the recipients of the letters, allowing them to understand her intentions and to address their concerns directly. Several of the neighbors had made commitments to check on Mrs. Graff regularly, and the letter writing had stopped without any formal charges being filed. This case had stayed with Detective Chun because it illustrated how police work often involved much more than law enforcement in the traditional sense. Detective Wong had solved not just a mystery, but had helped to restore a sense of community connection that had been fraying over time. She had understood that Mrs. Graff's behavior, while technically questionable, arose from genuine human need rather than malicious intent. The files from the late 1980s reflected a period of transition in both the community and the police department. New technologies were beginning to appear in the reports: answering machines, early personal computers, cable television. These changes were subtle, but they marked the beginning of a transformation in how people lived and interacted with each other. File 19881-203 documented an incident that had occurred during the holiday shopping season. Ms. Jennifer Walsh had reported that her car had been broken into while parked at the Northside Shopping Center. However, instead of taking anything from the vehicle, the intruder had left something behind: a neatly wrapped Christmas present with a tag that read, "For someone who needs a smile." Officer Kevin Murphy had responded to the call and had found the present exactly as Ms. Walsh had described. It was wrapped in red paper with a gold ribbon, and it contained a small stuffed teddy bear and a handwritten note that said, "I hope this brightens your day. From a friend." The incident had puzzled Officer Murphy, who was accustomed to investigating thefts from vehicles rather than mysterious gifts. He had dusted the car for fingerprints and had interviewed other shoppers who might have witnessed someone approaching Ms. Walsh's vehicle, but no leads had emerged. What made the case even more interesting was that similar incidents were reported over the next few days. Other shoppers found small gifts in their cars: homemade cookies, paperback books, small potted plants, holiday ornaments. In each case, the gifts were accompanied by brief notes expressing hope that the recipient would have a good day or a happy holiday season. Officer Murphy had expanded his investigation to include all the reported gift-giving incidents, looking for patterns that might lead to the identity of their mysterious benefactor. The gifts seemed to be left for people whose cars showed signs that they might be struggling financially: older vehicles, visible repair issues, or cars that were particularly dirty or cluttered inside. The gift-giving continued through the end of December and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Officer Murphy's final report concluded that no crime had been committed, as nothing had been stolen and no damage had been done to any vehicles. He had classified the incidents as suspicious activity only because they fell outside the normal range of human behavior that police officers were accustomed to dealing with. Reading this file years later, Detective Chun was struck by the kindness of the unknown gift giver and by Officer Murphy's respectful handling of what others might have dismissed as a non-issue. The person leaving those gifts had recognized something that the recipients themselves might not have realized: that the holiday season could be particularly difficult for people facing financial hardship. and that a small gesture of kindness from a stranger could provide much-needed emotional support. The shopping center where these incidents had taken place was part of a complex web of community spaces where people's lives intersected in ways both obvious and subtle. The gift giver had understood this and had used their knowledge of human nature to provide comfort to people who might have felt overlooked during a season that emphasized family, generosity, and material abundance. As Detective Chun reached the final section of files from the 1980s, she reflected on how these archived cases revealed the hidden life of the community. Each report was like a small window into the concerns, fears, and hopes of people trying to build lives in this particular place at this particular time. The officers who had written these reports had served not just as law enforcement agents, but as witnesses to the full spectrum of human experience. File 1989-0729 contained the documentation of a case that had particularly touched Detective Chun when she first encountered it several years earlier. It concerned a series of phone calls that had been made to elderly residents throughout the summer months. The calls were not the typical scam attempts that older people often received, but something much more unusual. The caller, who identified themselves only as a concerned neighbor, would call elderly residents to ask if they were feeling well, if they needed anything from the store, or if they would like someone to sit with them for a while. The caller never asked for money, never requested personal information, and never suggested meeting in person. They simply offered conversation and emotional support to people who might be feeling isolated or lonely. Initially, several recipients of these calls had contacted the police because they were suspicious of the caller's motives. In an era of increasing awareness about telephone scams targeting the elderly, any unsolicited call could seem potentially threatening. Detective Paul Rodriguez had been assigned to investigate, expecting to uncover some form of fraud or manipulation. However, Detective Rodriguez's investigation revealed that the caller was genuine in their intentions. Mrs. Rose Martin, an 82-year-old resident of Pine Street, had begun making the calls after reading a newspaper article about the health risks of social isolation among elderly people. She had obtained a list of seniors in the community through her church and had begun calling them simply to provide human connection. Mrs. Martin had been careful to respect people's privacy and boundaries. When recipients expressed discomfort with the calls, she immediately removed their names from her list. For those who seemed to welcome the contact, she established a regular calling schedule, checking in once or twice a week to ask about their health and to offer practical assistance if needed. Detective Rodriguez had interviewed several of the call recipients and had found that Mrs. Martin had genuinely helped to improve their quality of life. Some had been dealing with health issues and appreciated having someone to talk with about their concerns. Others had simply been lonely and had welcomed the opportunity for regular conversation with a friendly voice. The case had been closed with no charges filed, as no laws had been broken and no harm had been done. Detective Rodriguez had commended Mrs. Martin for her community service and had suggested that she might want to formalize her efforts through one of the local senior service organizations. This case had remained meaningful to Detective Chun because it demonstrated how police work often involved distinguishing between genuinely suspicious behavior and activities that were simply outside the normal range of social interaction. Mrs. Martin's telephone outreach program had alarmed some recipients only because acts of kindness between strangers had become so unusual that they seemed potentially threatening. The archives contained hundreds of similar cases where officers had been called upon to investigate activities that turned out to be expressions of human kindness, creativity, or eccentricity rather than criminal behavior. These cases required officers to exercise judgment, empathy, and wisdom in determining how to respond to citizen concerns while protecting the rights of people whose only crime was being different or unusually generous. As Detective Chun prepared to leave the archives for the night, She paused to consider the larger story that these files told about the community and the people who lived in it. Each case was a small piece of a much larger puzzle, a fragment of the ongoing human drama that played out on these streets, in these neighborhoods, among these families and individuals who had chosen to make their lives in this particular place. The police officers who had written these reports had understood that their role extended far beyond simply enforcing laws. They had served as guardians of community peace, as mediators in disputes between neighbors, as protectors of the vulnerable, and as witnesses to both the best and worst aspects of human nature. Their careful documentation had created a record not just of crimes and investigations, but of the full complexity of life in a small American city. The building around Detective Chun held decades of such stories, each one carefully filed away in its proper place, each one representing someone's encounter with the police department and, by extension, with the larger systems of law and order that governed community life. The stories ranged from tragic to heartwarming, from mysterious to mundane, but each one had been important enough to someone to justify an official report. As she turned off the lights and locked the archive room behind her, Detective Chun carried with her the accumulated weight of all those stories, all those carefully documented moments of human experience. Tomorrow night, she might return to explore a different section of the files, to discover new stories that would add to her understanding of the community's hidden history. The building settled into its nighttime quiet, the archives resting peacefully until someone else would come to search through their contents, looking for connections between past and present, seeking to understand how yesterday's mysteries had become today's memories. In the darkness, the files waited patiently, each one a small testament to the ongoing human story that continued to unfold in the streets and neighborhoods outside these walls. Story 2. Every report told two stories, the one that happened and the one that could be proven. The morning shift brought a different energy to the police station, but in the records department, time moved at its own measured pace. Here, beneath the fluorescent lights that never quite managed to banish the shadows from the corners of the room, the business of documentation continued with the same steady rhythm it had maintained for decades. Sergeant Patricia Coleman had spent 15 years in the records department, and she understood better than most how the simple act of writing down what had happened could transform chaos into order, confusion into clarity, fear into manageable fact. Each report that crossed her desk represented someone's worst day, or their most puzzling moment, or sometimes their encounter with something that defied easy explanation. The process of creating a police report was both art and science. Officers arriving back at the station after responding to calls would sit at the old wooden desks that had been salvaged from a school renovation in 1975. Their notebooks spread before them, translating the messy reality of human experience into the clean language of official documentation. The forms themselves had evolved over the years, but their essential purpose remained unchanged: to create a permanent record that could be referenced, analyzed, and understood by anyone who might need to review the case in the future. Report number 199-00234 had arrived on Sergeant Coleman's desk on a Tuesday morning in February. Officer Daniel Kim had responded to a call about a disturbance at the Riverside Apartments, a complex of modest two-story buildings that housed many of the community's working families. The caller, Mrs. Susan Torres, had reported hearing what sounded like furniture being moved in the apartment above hers. But the sounds had continued for several hours and seemed too deliberate and rhythmic to be normal moving activity. Officer Kim had arrived at the complex at 10:15 a.m. and had spoken first with Mrs. Torres, who lived in apartment 2A. She had explained that the sounds had begun around midnight and had continued intermittently through the night. They consisted of what seemed to be heavy objects being dragged across the floor, followed by periods of complete silence. Then more dragging sounds. Mrs. Torres had tried to sleep through the noise initially, But by 3 a.m., she had become concerned enough to consider calling the police. What had finally prompted her to make the call, Mrs. Torres explained to Officer Kim, was not just the noise itself, but its strange pattern. The sounds were too regular, too purposeful, to be someone simply rearranging furniture. They occurred in sets of 3. Drag, pause, drag, pause, drag, pause. Then several minutes of silence before the pattern would repeat. Officer Kim had proceeded to apartment 3A, directly above Mrs. Torres's unit. He had knocked repeatedly, but received no response. The apartment manager, Mr. Carl Henderson, had been contacted and had arrived with keys to the unit. Mr. Henderson had explained that the apartment was rented by Mr. David Walsh, a quiet man in his 60s, who worked nights at the local manufacturing plant and usually slept during the day. When Officer Kim and Mr. Henderson had entered the apartment, they found it empty of both people and furniture. The living room, bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom were completely vacant except for a few pieces of clothing hanging in the bedroom closet and a single chair positioned in the center of the living room facing the window that looked down onto the parking lot. Mr. Henderson had been as surprised as Officer Kim by the apartment's condition. According to his records, Mr. Walsh had lived in the unit for 3 years and had paid his rent promptly every month. Mr. Henderson had not been notified of any intention to move, and Mr. Walsh's lease was not set to expire for another 6 months. Officer Kim had documented the scene carefully, noting the position of the single remaining chair, the absence of any signs of struggle or forced entry, and the fact that the apartment's utilities were still connected and functioning. He had also observed that the hardwood floors showed no scratch marks or other signs that heavy furniture had been dragged across them recently. The investigation had continued over the following days. Officer Kim had attempted to contact Mr. Walsh at his workplace, only to discover that Mr. Walsh had not reported to work for his scheduled shifts over the past week. His supervisor at the plant, Ms. Jennifer Park, had indicated that this was highly unusual behavior from Mr. Walsh, who had been a reliable employee for over 5 years. Efforts to locate Mr. Walsh through his personal contacts had proven difficult, as he appeared to have few close relationships in the community. His emergency contact information listed a sister in another state, but when Officer Kim contacted her, she indicated that she had not spoken with her brother in over a year and knew nothing about his current circumstances. The case had remained open for several weeks while Officer Kim continued his investigation. He had interviewed other residents of the apartment complex, but none had observed Mr. Walsh leaving the building with furniture or moving equipment. The parking lot security cameras, which had limited coverage, showed Mr. Walsh's car leaving the complex on the evening before the noise complaints began, but the vehicle had not been seen returning. Eventually, Mr. Walsh had contacted the apartment manager by telephone to inform him that he would not be returning to the apartment and to request that his security deposit be forfeited in lieu of proper notice. He had provided a mailing address in another state where his personal belongings from the closet could be sent. When Mr. Henderson had asked about the missing furniture, Mr. Walsh had simply said that he had made other arrangements for it. The case had been closed as a civil matter between tenant and landlord, with no evidence of criminal activity. However, the mystery of the nighttime sounds that had prompted Mrs. Torres's complaint was never resolved. Officer Kim's final report had noted that no explanation had been found for the dragging sounds that had lasted several hours on the night before Mr. Walsh's disappearance was discovered. Sergeant Coleman had filed this report in the appropriate section of the archives, but she had often thought about it during her quiet moments in the records department. There was something about the image of that single chair facing the window, about the careful pattern of the sounds Mrs. Torres had heard, That suggested a story more complex than what had been captured in the official documentation. Police reports, by their nature, focused on observable facts and verifiable information. They were not designed to capture the emotional undercurrents or psychological mysteries that often surrounded the incidents they documented. Yet sometimes, as in Mr. Walsh's case, the facts themselves seemed to point toward deeper questions that could not be answered through conventional investigation. Report number 1991-567 had presented a different kind of documentation challenge. Officer Lisa Martinez had been dispatched to investigate a complaint about graffiti at the Eastside Community Center. The building served multiple functions: a meeting place for neighborhood groups, a venue for children's after-school programs, and a polling location during elections. The graffiti that had prompted the complaint was unusual in several respects. Rather than the typical spray-painted tags or profanity that characterized most vandalism of this type, someone had used chalk to write carefully formed sentences on the brick walls of the building. The messages were not threatening or offensive, but they had nevertheless concerned the community center's director, Ms. Dorothy Chun, enough to contact the police. Officer Martinez had arrived at the scene to find 12 different messages written in neat, uniform handwriting across the building's exterior walls. The messages were philosophical in nature and included statements like, "Time moves differently for everyone," and "What we remember changes who we are," and the spaces between words contain their own meaning. Each message was written in the same pale blue chalk and appeared to have been created by the same person. The handwriting was precise and deliberate, suggesting that the author had taken considerable care in crafting both the content and the appearance of the messages. Officer Martinez had photographed each message and had measured their placement on the walls, noting that they were positioned at eye level and spaced evenly around the building's perimeter. Ms. Chun had explained to Officer Martinez that the messages had appeared overnight and had been discovered by the custodial staff when they arrived for work that morning. The community center had been locked and secured the previous evening, and there were no signs of forced entry or other vandalism. The only unusual element was the presence of these carefully written, philosophical statements. Officer Martinez had canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with residents who lived near the community center and asking whether anyone had observed suspicious activity during the night. The interviews had revealed no witnesses to the actual creation of the graffiti, but several residents had commented on the thoughtful nature of the messages and had expressed hope that whoever had written them would not be prosecuted too harshly. The investigation had taken an interesting turn when Officer Martinez had contacted local schools to inquire about whether the incident might be connected to a student art project or philosophy. ASSIGNMEN's Rebecca Walsh, a teacher at the nearby high school, had recognized the philosophical themes of the messages and had suggested that they might be related to a unit on existentialism that she had been teaching in her advanced literature class. However, when Officer Martinez had interviewed Ms. Walsh's students, none had admitted to creating the messages, and Ms. Walsh had indicated that the assignment in question had involved written essays rather than public displays of any kind. The students had been as curious about the identity of the chalk philosopher as everyone else in the community. The case had been complicated by the community's mixed response to the graffiti. While Ms. Chun and the Community Center Board had felt obligated to report the vandalism, many residents had expressed appreciation for the messages and had suggested that they added a thoughtful element to the neighborhood. Several people had specifically requested that the messages be left in place rather than removed immediately. Officer Martinez had consulted with the district attorney's office about how to proceed. Given the unusual nature of the incident, the messages clearly constituted vandalism in the legal sense, as they had been placed on the building without permission. However, they had caused no permanent damage, as chalk could be easily removed, and they contained no offensive or threatening content. The resolution had come when an anonymous letter had been left at the police station, typed on plain paper with no signature or identifying information. The letter had contained an apology for the unauthorized use of the community center walls and had included a check for $50 to cover cleaning costs. The letter had explained that the author had intended the messages as a gift to the community, a way of encouraging people to think about deeper questions as they went about their daily routines. The case had been closed without charges being filed, and the messages had been allowed to remain on the building walls until they gradually faded due to weather exposure over the following months. Officer Martinez had filed the anonymous letter with her report, noting that it represented an unusual resolution to an unusual case. This type of incident had become more common in the early 1990s, Sergeant Coleman had observed. The community seemed to be experiencing a period of creative expression that sometimes crossed the boundary between art and vandalism. The police department had found itself in the position of having to balance property owners' rights with the community's growing tolerance for unconventional forms of public expression. Report number 1992-891 had documented another example of this trend. Officer Robert Hayes had been called to investigate a complaint about unauthorized installation of birdhouses throughout Riverside Park. The park's maintenance supervisor, Mr. James Morrison, had discovered 12 small wooden birdhouses that had been mounted on trees and fence posts throughout the park overnight. The Possum 8 birdhouses were professionally constructed and painted in bright colors that complemented the park's existing landscaping. Each one was positioned at an appropriate height and location to actually attract birds, and they appeared to have been installed with care to avoid damage to the trees or other park infrastructure. Hayes had examined each birdhouse and had found them to be well crafted and properly secured. They were clearly not temporary installations, as they had been mounted with weatherproof hardware and had been painted with outdoor-grade paint. Someone had invested considerable time, skill, and money in creating these additions to the park. Mr. Morrison had been concerned about the pathetic, unauthorized nature of the installations, even though he had acknowledged that the birdhouses were attractive and appeared to serve a legitimate purpose. Park policies required that any additions to the grounds be approved by the Parks Department, and no such approval had been requested or granted for the birdhouses. The investigation had revealed that the birdhouses had been created by Mr. Edward Kim, a retired carpenter who lived near the park and had been concerned about the declining bird population in the area. Mr. Kim had spent several months crafting the birdhouses in his garage workshop, designing each one to attract different species of birds that he had observed in the park. During his daily walks, when Officer Hayes had interviewed Mr. Kim, he had readily admitted to installing the birdhouses and had explained his reasoning. He had been troubled by the fact that urban development in the area had reduced the number of natural nesting sites available to birds, and he had wanted to provide alternative habitat that would help maintain the park's ecosystem. Mr. Kim had been unaware that park policy required approval for such installations. He had assumed that anything that benefited the park and its wildlife would be welcomed by the community. He had installed the birdhouses at night not to avoid detection, but to surprise park visitors with a pleasant discovery during their morning walks. The case had been resolved through a meeting between Mr. Kim, park officials, and representatives from the city council. Mr. Kim's birdhouses had been retroactively approved and had been allowed to remain in place. The Parks Department had also invited Mr. Kim to participate in an official volunteer program for park improvement projects. Officer Hayes had documented this resolution in a follow-up report, noting that it represented a successful example of community collaboration and problem-solving. The incident had led to the creation of a formal process for residents to propose park improvements. ensuring that future well-intentioned projects could be implemented through proper channels. These cases from the early 1990s reflected a community that was grappling with questions about public space, individual expression, and collective responsibility. The police reports documenting these incidents captured not just the immediate legal and administrative issues involved, but also the broader social dynamics that were shaping how people related to their shared environment. Report number 1993 to 0445 had presented yet another variation on these themes. Officer Jennifer Walsh had been dispatched to investigate reports of an unauthorized garden that had been planted on a vacant lot in the residential district. The lot, which belonged to the city and had been empty for several years, had been transformed overnight into a small vegetable garden, complete with neat rows of plants, a simple irrigation system, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Community Garden, please share." The complaint had been filed by Mr. Timothy Park, who lived adjacent to the lot and had been concerned about liability issues and property rights. Mr. Park had acknowledged that the garden was attractive and well-maintained, but he had worried about the precedent that would be set if unauthorized use of city property was allowed to continue. Officer Walsh had examined the garden carefully and had found it to be professionally planned and executed. The person or persons responsible had clearly possessed significant gardening knowledge and had invested considerable effort in preparing the soil, selecting appropriate plants for the local climate, and establishing an efficient watering system. The garden contained a variety of vegetables that were commonly grown in the area: tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, carrots, and several types of herbs. Everything was carefully labeled with small wooden stakes, and a notebook in a waterproof container provided information about planting dates, care instructions, and harvest times. The investigation had revealed that the garden was the work of Mrs. Maria Santos, a retired teacher who had been frustrated by the waste of the empty lot and had decided to put it to productive use. Mrs. Santos had been gardening for most of her adult life and had previously maintained a large garden at her own home before moving to an apartment that lacked yard space. When Officer Walsh had interviewed Mrs. Santos, she had explained that she had researched the ownership of the lot and had attempted to contact city officials about obtaining permission to create a garden. However, she had been unable to navigate the bureaucratic process successfully and had decided to proceed with the project while continuing her efforts to obtain official approval. Mrs. Santos had emphasized that her intention was to benefit the community rather than to claim ownership of the land. She had posted the "Please Share" sign because she hoped that neighbors would feel free to harvest vegetables from the garden and that some might even volunteer to help with its maintenance. The case had attracted significant community attention, with many residents expressing support for Mrs. Santos and her garden project. A petition had been circulated asking the city to allow the garden to continue, and several neighborhood organizations had offered to help formalize the project through proper channels. The resolution had involved extensive coordination between the police department, city planning officials, and community groups. The garden had ultimately been approved as a pilot project for urban agriculture, with Mrs. Santos serving as the volunteer coordinator. The success of the project had led to the establishment of several additional community gardens on other vacant lots throughout the city. Officer Walsh's report had documented not just the immediate incident, but also the broader community response and the eventual policy changes that had resulted from Mrs. Santos's initiative. This type of comprehensive documentation was becoming more common as police officers recognized their role in facilitating positive community development rather than simply enforcing regulations. The mid-1990s had brought new challenges and opportunities for police documentation, as technology began to change both the nature of crimes and the tools available for investigating them. Report number 1995-0678 had been one of the first in Sergeant Coleman's experience to involve what would later become known as cybercrime. Officer David Rodriguez had been called to investigate a complaint from Mr. Kevin Walsh, who operated a small computer consulting business from his home office. Mr. Walsh had reported that someone had been accessing his computer system remotely and had been leaving messages in his word processing documents. The messages were benign in content, consisting of observations about Mr. Walsh's work habits and suggestions for improving his business operations. However, the unauthorized access to his computer system represented a serious security breach, and Mr. Walsh had been concerned about the potential for more malicious activity. Officer Rodriguez had found himself investigating a type of crime that was not yet well understood by law enforcement. Computer systems and internet connectivity were still relatively new phenomena, and the legal framework for addressing computer-related crimes was still developing. The investigation had required Officer Rodriguez to educate himself about computer technology while simultaneously trying to gather evidence and identify a suspect. The case had been complicated by the fact that the intruder had demonstrated considerable technical skill and had left few traces of their activity. The messages left in Mr. Walsh's documents were the only clear evidence that unauthorized access had occurred, and these provided few clues about the identity or location of the person responsible. Officer Rodriguez had consulted with computer experts at the state police level and had learned about new investigative techniques that were being developed to address technology-related crimes. However, the case had ultimately remained unsolved due to the limited tools and expertise available at the local level for investigating such incidents. The report had concluded with recommendations for improved computer security measures and had noted the need for additional training and resources to address what was likely to become a growing category of criminal activity. Officer Rodriguez had also documented his own learning process as he had navigated the unfamiliar territory of computer crime investigation. This case had marked the beginning of a significant shift in the nature of police work, as officers began to encounter crimes that existed primarily in digital rather than physical space. The documentation challenges were considerable, as traditional police reporting procedures were not well suited to describing activities that occurred within computer systems and networks. By the late 1990s, the police department had begun to adapt its reporting procedures to address technological crimes. But the early cases like Mr. Walsh's represented a period of transition when officers were working without clear guidelines or precedents. The reports from this era captured both the confusion and the creativity that characterized law enforcement's initial response to the digital age. Report number 19981-234 had documented another early example of technology-related criminal activity. Officer Sarah Chun had investigated a series of prank phone calls that had been made to elderly residents using computer-generated voices. The calls had not been threatening, but they had been disturbing to the recipients because of their artificial nature and the unusual content of the messages. The computer-generated voice had delivered messages that were philosophical in nature, similar to the chalk graffiti incident from several years earlier. However, the technology involved had made the calls particularly unsettling, as recipients had been uncertain whether they were speaking with a human being or a machine. Officer Chun had worked with telephone company technicians to trace the source of the calls, but the investigation had been hampered by the callers' use of technology to disguise their identity and location. The case had required Officer Chun to develop new investigative skills and to collaborate with technical experts who understood the emerging technologies being used in criminal activity. The documentation of these early technology crimes had been challenging because the evidence was often intangible and the methods used were not easily described in traditional police report language. Officers had been forced to create new vocabulary and new categories of evidence to capture the essential elements of crimes that existed primarily in digital form. As Sergeant Coleman reviewed these reports from the 1990s, she could see how the fundamental nature of police work had remained constant, even as the tools and techniques had evolved. Officers had continued to respond to citizen complaints, to investigate unusual incidents, and to document their findings in careful detail. However, the complexity of the crimes and the sophistication of the methods used had increased significantly. The reports from the late 1990s also reflected changes in community attitudes toward authority, privacy, and individual expression. Citizens had become more assertive about their rights and more willing to challenge official policies that they considered unreasonable. Police officers had found themselves mediating between competing interests and helping to develop new approaches to community problems. Report number 1990567 had documented a case that illustrated these changing dynamics. Officer Michael Torres had been called to investigate a complaint about unauthorized street art that had appeared on the underside of the Main Street bridge. The artwork consisted of a large mural depicting the history of the local community, painted in bright colors and executed with professional skill. The mural had been created without permission from the city, which owned the bridge, but it had received overwhelmingly positive response from community members, who viewed it as a valuable addition to the downtown area. The complaint had been filed by a single individual who had been concerned about the precedent of allowing unauthorized use of public property. Officer Torres had found himself in the position of investigating what was technically vandalism, but what the community considered to be public art. The mural was historically accurate and tastefully executed, and many residents had expressed hope that it would be allowed to remain permanently. The investigation had revealed that the mural was the work of Ms. Lisa Kim, a professional artist who had grown up in the community and had wanted to create something that would celebrate the area's heritage. Kim had spent months researching local history and had consulted with elderly residents to ensure that her depiction of historical events was accurate and respectful. The resolution of the case had involved extensive community discussion and negotiation between various stakeholders. The mural had ultimately been approved retroactively, and Ms. Kim had been commissioned to create additional public art projects for the city. The success of the Main Street mural had led to the establishment of an official public art program that provided a framework for future projects. Officer Torres had documented not just the immediate incident, but also the community process that had led to its resolution. His report had included detailed descriptions of the mural's content, the quality of its execution, and the community response it had generated. This comprehensive approach to documentation had become more common as officers recognized the importance of capturing the full context of incidents rather than focusing solely on legal violations. The transition from the 1990s to the new millennium had brought new challenges and opportunities for police documentation. The Y2K computer concerns that had dominated headlines had created a heightened awareness of technology's role in society, and law enforcement agencies had been forced to prepare for potential disruptions to their own record-keeping systems. Report number 2000-0101 had been the first filed in the new millennium, and it had documented a case that seemed to symbolize the community's hopes and concerns about the future. Officer Patricia Wong had investigated reports of mysterious lights that had been seen in the sky on New Year's Eve, with several residents calling to report possible UFO activity. The investigation had revealed that the lights were actually paper lanterns that had been released as part of a private celebration, but the incident had reflected the sense of anticipation and uncertainty that had characterized the community's transition into the new century. Officer Wong's report had captured both the factual explanation for the lights and the emotional context that had made them seem significant to observers. As Sergeant Coleman prepared to close her review of the 1990s reports, she reflected on how the decade had marked a period of significant transition for both the police department and the community it served. The reports from this era documented not just individual incidents, but also the broader social changes that were reshaping how people lived, worked, and related to each other. The careful documentation maintained by officers throughout this period had created a record of adaptation and growth, of a community learning to balance tradition with innovation, individual rights with collective responsibility. Each report represented not just an incident that had required police attention, but also a moment in the ongoing evolution of social norms and expectations. The files containing these reports would continue to rest in the archives, available for future reference by officers, researchers, and community members who might need to understand how particular issues had been addressed in the past. The meticulous attention to detail that characterized these documents ensured that future generations would be able to learn from the experiences and decisions of those who had served before them. In the quiet of the records room, surrounded by decades of carefully documented human experience, Sergeant Coleman understood that she was part of a continuous tradition of public service that extended far beyond her individual contribution. The reports she processed and filed each day would eventually join the historical record, adding to the accumulated wisdom available to those who would face similar challenges in the future. Asterisk. Story 3. Asterisk. In the deepest corners of the archives, dust settled like memory on files that held secrets no one remembered to seek. The basement archives stretched further than most people realized. Beyond the main filing area where Detective Chen conducted her evening explorations, additional corridors led to storage rooms that held the oldest records. Cases from decades past that had been transferred from active files to permanent storage. Here, in rooms lit by single bulbs hanging from the ceiling, the earliest history of the police department rested in boxes and cabinets that rarely felt the touch of human hands. Asterisk. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman had been the archive custodian for 37 years before her retirement in 1995. Her replacement, Mr. Daniel Park, had inherited not just a job, but a sacred trust to maintain the integrity of records that stretched back to the department's founding. Mr. Park understood that these files represented more than mere paperwork. They were the institutional memory of the community, the accumulated wisdom of generations, of police officers who had faced every conceivable human situation. Organization system that Mrs. Hoffman had developed over her decades of service was both logical and intuitive. The oldest files were stored in the rooms furthest from the main entrance, arranged chronologically within each room, with cross-references for cases that had connections across different time periods. Each box was labeled not just with dates and case numbers, but with brief descriptions that would help future researchers understand the nature of the contents without having to open every container. In Storage Room C, boxes lined metal shelving units from floor to ceiling, each one containing approximately 40 to 50 case files from the 1950s and early 1960s. These files had a particular character that reflected their era. The paper was heavier. The typewriter ribbons had created darker, more permanent impressions. And the language used in the reports carried the formal tone of an age when police work was considered a calling rather than simply a profession. Box C-47 contained files from the winter of 1956, a season that had been particularly challenging for the police department due to a series of severe snowstorms that had isolated the community for weeks at a time. The reports from this period documented not just crimes, but the extraordinary efforts of officers to maintain public safety under difficult conditions. File 195608892 detailed an incident that had occurred during the worst of the winter storms. Officer Thomas Walsh had received a call about a missing person, Mrs. Dorothy Kim, an elderly woman who lived alone on Elm Street, had not been seen for 3 days. Her neighbor, Mr. Carl Henderson, had become concerned when he noticed that no smoke was coming from her chimney despite the bitter cold. and that her morning newspaper had been accumulating on her front porch. Officer Walsh had responded to the call despite road conditions that made travel dangerous. His report described the difficulty of reaching Mrs. Kim's house through snowdrifts that reached nearly to his waist, and the eerie silence that surrounded the small frame house when he finally arrived. The house was dark, with no signs of activity inside, but the front door was securely locked and showed no signs of forced entry. After receiving no response to repeated knocking, Officer Walsh had contacted Mrs. Kim's emergency contact, her nephew, Mr. James Park, who lived in the next town. Mr. Park had provided permission for Officer Walsh to enter the house through a window to check on his aunt's welfare. Inside, Officer Walsh had found the house cold and empty, with no sign of Mrs. Kim. Her winter coat was missing from the front closet, and her purse was not in its usual place on the kitchen table. However, there were no signs of struggle or disturbance, and valuable items remained undisturbed throughout the house. The investigation had continued for several days, complicated by the weather conditions that limited search efforts. Officer Walsh had interviewed neighbors who might have seen Mrs. Kim before her disappearance, but the storm had kept most residents indoors, and no one had observed her leaving her house. The mystery had been resolved 4 days later when Mrs. Kim had contacted the police station by telephone from her daughter's house in another state. She explained that she had become concerned about spending the winter alone during such severe weather, and had decided to travel to stay with her daughter until spring. She had attempted to notify her neighbors before leaving, but the phone lines had been down due to the storm, and she had been unable to reach anyone. Mrs. Kim had walked to the bus station early on the morning of her departure, before the worst of the storm had arrived. She had been able to catch the last bus out of town before the roads became impassable. Her daughter had been expecting her, but had been unable to call the police to report that Mrs. Kim had arrived safely because long-distance telephone service had been disrupted by the storm. Officer Walsh's final report had commended Mrs. Kim for her practical approach to ensuring her safety during the severe weather, while also noting the challenges that communication disruptions could create for both residents and police during emergency situations. His documentation had included recommendations for improving emergency communication procedures that were later implemented by the department. This case had remained memorable not because of any criminal activity, but because it illustrated the importance of community connections during times of crisis. The concern that Mr. Henderson had shown for his elderly neighbor, the thoroughness of Officer Walsh's investigation despite dangerous conditions, and Mrs. Kim's resourcefulness in ensuring her own safety had all contributed to a positive outcome in what could have been a tragic situation. The files from the late 1950s contained many similar examples of police work that extended far beyond law enforcement to include community welfare and emergency response. Officers of this era had understood that their role included serving as the primary point of contact between isolated residents and the larger support systems that could help them during difficult times. File 1958 to 1134 documented another case that had tested the department's ability to serve the community during challenging circumstances. Officer Robert Hayes had received a report about strange lights and sounds coming from the abandoned Riverside Mill, a large brick building that had been closed for several years following the decline of the local textile industry. The report had come from Mr. Edward Santos, who lived in a farmhouse approximately half a mile from the mill. Mr. Santos had observed lights moving through the building's windows during the late evening hours, and had heard what sounded like machinery operating inside the supposedly empty structure. Officer Hayes had investigated the mill on 3 separate occasions, each time finding the building secured and showing no signs of recent entry. The main doors were chained shut with locks that appeared to be undisturbed, and the windows were too high and narrow to allow easy access. However, Mr. Santos had continued to report the mysterious lights and sounds, insisting that something was definitely occurring inside the building. The investigation had taken an interesting turn when Officer Hayes had decided to conduct overnight surveillance of the mill, positioning himself in a location where he could observe the building without being seen. He had indeed witnessed lights moving through the interior windows during the early morning hours. The lights appeared to be handheld lanterns or flashlights, moving in patterns that suggested people were walking through the building's various rooms. Officer Hayes had also heard the sounds that Mr. Santos had described, rhythmic mechanical noises that seemed to come from the building's lower level. The sounds were not loud enough to identify their source, but they definitely suggested that some kind of equipment was operating inside the supposedly empty mill. Further investigation had revealed that a group of local men had been using the abandoned mill as an informal workshop where they repaired farm equipment and machinery for other community members. They had gained access to the building through a basement entrance that was not visible from the road, and had been using portable generators to power their tools. The group had been led by Mr. Frank Morrison, a skilled mechanic who had lost his job when the mill closed. Rather than leaving the community to seek work elsewhere, Mr. Morrison had organized this cooperative workshop where men with various technical skills could help each other maintain the equipment that was essential to their livelihoods. When Officer Hayes had interviewed the workshop participants, he had learned that they had been conducting their activities at night to avoid drawing attention from the building's owners, who might have objected to the unauthorized use of the property. The men had been careful to leave no trace of their presence and had been scrupulous about preventing any damage to the building or its remaining equipment. Resolution of the case had required delicate negotiation between the workshop group, the mill's owners, and local officials. Eventually, a formal arrangement had been reached that allowed the workshop to continue operating in a designated section of the building, with the participants paying a modest rent and assuming responsibility for basic maintenance and security. Officer Hayes had documented this resolution in a follow-up report that emphasized the positive community impact of the workshop arrangement. Several farms in the area had benefited from affordable equipment repairs, and the cooperative nature of the project had strengthened relationships among men who might otherwise have been forced to leave the community to find work. This case had illustrated how police officers often served as mediators in situations where community needs conflicted with strict interpretations of property rights or regulations. The ability to find creative solutions that served everyone's interests while maintaining public safety had been an essential skill for officers working in small communities where personal relationships and local knowledge were as important as legal authority. The archives from the 1960s reflected significant social changes that had affected both police work and community life. The files from this decade documented new types of incidents that reflected changing attitudes toward authority, individual expression, and social responsibility. File 1967-445 contained the report of an incident that had occurred during what would later be remembered as the Summer of Love. Officer Jennifer Walsh had been dispatched to investigate a complaint about a large gathering of young people in Riverside Park. The caller, Mrs. Susan Torres, had reported that approximately 50 teenagers and young adults had assembled in the park and were engaged in activities that concerned her. When Officer Walsh had arrived at the park, she had found the gathering exactly as described: a large group of young people, most appearing to be in their late teens or early 20s, sitting in a circle on the grass near the park's central pavilion. However, the activities that had prompted the complaint were not what Officer Walsh had expected based on similar calls she had received in other contexts. Young people were engaged in what appeared to be a structured discussion about philosophy, literature, and social issues. Several participants were reading aloud from books of poetry, while others were sharing their own original writings. The atmosphere was peaceful and contemplative, with no signs of disruptive behavior or illegal activity. Officer Walsh had approached the group and had spoken with several participants about the nature of their gathering. She had learned that they had organized what they called a be-in, a public meeting designed to promote peace, understanding, and intellectual discussion. The participants had come from various communities in the region and had chosen the park as their meeting place because of its natural beauty and its symbolic significance as a public space open to all citizens. Young people had been respectful and cooperative. During Officer Walsh's inquiry, explaining their goals and activities in detail and expressing their desire to conduct their gathering in a way that would not disturb other park users. They had brought their own food and beverages, had made arrangements for cleaning up after themselves, and had designated several participants to ensure that their activities remained peaceful and orderly. Officer Walsh had found no basis for asking the group to disperse, as they were engaged in activities that were clearly protected by the First Amendment and were violating no park regulations. However, she had been concerned about the potential for the gathering to grow larger and possibly attract participants whose intentions might be less benign than those of the current group. The resolution had involved ongoing communication between Officer Walsh, park officials, and the organizers of the be-in. The gathering had continued for 3 days, with participants coming and going, but the core group maintaining their focus on peaceful discussion and artistic expression. No incidents had occurred, and the participants had left the park in better condition than they had found it. Officer Walsh's report had documented not just the immediate incident, but also the broader social context that had made such gatherings increasingly common during this period. Her observations about the participants' behavior, their stated goals, and their interaction with authority figures had provided valuable insight into changing youth culture and its implications for police work. This case had marked the beginning of a period when police officers would be called upon to deal with new forms of social expression that challenged traditional boundaries between private and public behavior. The ability to distinguish between genuinely threatening activities and those that were merely unfamiliar or unconventional had become an essential skill for officers working during this era of rapid social change. The late 1960s files contained numerous examples of incidents that required officers to exercise judgment about when to intervene in activities that were technically legal but socially controversial. File 19690778 documented Officer David Rodriguez's investigation of complaints about underground newspapers that were being distributed on street corners in the downtown area. The newspapers in question contained articles critical of government policies, alternative lifestyle advice, and advertisements for what were described as consciousness-expanding products and services. While the content was not illegal, several business owners and community leaders had expressed concern about the impact of these publications on the city's image and their potential influence on young people. Officer Rodriguez had conducted a thorough investigation of the newspaper distribution operation, interviewing both the distributors and those who had complained about their activities. He had learned that the newspapers were being produced by a small group of local college students who were exercising their right to free speech and free press as protected by the Constitution. Distributors had been careful to comply with all applicable laws regarding publication and distribution of printed materials. They had obtained the necessary permits, had paid any required taxes, and had restricted their distribution activities to public sidewalks where such activities were legally permitted. The investigation had revealed that the complaints about the newspapers were based primarily on disagreement with their political and social content rather than on any specific illegal activities. Officer Rodriguez had concluded that the distributors had the right to continue their activities as long as they remained within the bounds of applicable laws and regulations. However, the case had required extensive documentation and careful legal research to ensure that the department's response was appropriate and consistent with constitutional protections. Officer Rodriguez had consulted with the district attorney's office and had reviewed relevant court decisions to confirm his understanding of the applicable legal principles. Resolution had involved education and communication rather than enforcement action. Officer Rodriguez had met with the business owners who had filed complaints to explain the legal limitations on the police department's authority to restrict constitutionally protected activities. He had also spoken with the newspaper distributors about their responsibilities to conduct their activities in a way that minimized conflicts with other citizens. This case had established important precedents for how the department would handle future incidents involving unconventional forms of expression or communication. Officer Rodriguez's careful documentation of the legal research and consultation process had created a resource that other officers could reference when facing similar situations. The 1970s files reflected continued evolution in the types of cases that required police attention, as social changes that had begun in the previous decade became more mainstream and accepted. File 1974-0556 documented Officer Lisa Martinez's investigation of a complaint about an alternative healing practice that had been established in a converted garage on Maple Street. The practice had been started by Ms. Dorothy Chun, who offered services that she described as holistic health consultation and energy balancing therapy. Ms. Chun's clients included people seeking alternatives to conventional medical treatment, as well as those who were interested in spiritual and philosophical approaches to wellness. The complaint had been filed by Dr. James Park, a local physician who was concerned that Ms. Chun's practice might be constituting unlicensed medical practice, or might be discouraging people from seeking appropriate medical care for serious health conditions. Officer Martinez had investigated the practice carefully, interviewing Ms. Chun about her background, training, and methods, and speaking with several of her clients about their experiences and the advice they had received. She had also consulted with health department officials about the regulations that might apply to Ms. Chun's activities. The investigation had revealed that Ms. Chen was careful to describe her services as complementary to rather than substitutes for conventional medical care. She provided written disclaimers to all clients stating that her services were not intended to diagnose or treat medical conditions, and she encouraged clients to maintain relationships with licensed medical professionals. Ms. Chun's background included extensive training in various alternative healing traditions, and she had been operating her practice in other communities for several years without incident. Her clients spoke positively about her services and indicated that they understood the limitations of what she offered. Officer Martinez had concluded that Ms. Chen's practice did not violate any applicable laws or regulations, as she was not claiming to be a medical doctor and was not prescribing medications or performing procedures that required medical licensing. However, the investigation had highlighted the need for clear guidelines about how such practices should be regulated to protect public health while respecting individual choice. The case had been resolved through the development of voluntary guidelines that Ms. Chun agreed to follow, including maintaining appropriate disclaimers, keeping detailed records of her consultations, and establishing procedures for referring clients to medical professionals when appropriate. This type of case had become increasingly common during the 1970s as interest in alternative approaches to health, spirituality, and lifestyle had grown. Police officers had found themselves mediating between traditional institutions and new forms of practice that challenged conventional boundaries. The files from the late 1970s and early 1980s documented the department's adaptation to these changing social conditions. File 1981-0667 contained Officer Kevin Murphy's investigation of a complaint about a food cooperative that had been established in the basement of the community center. The cooperative had been organized by a group of families who wanted to purchase organic and natural foods in bulk quantities to reduce costs and ensure quality. The operation involved collecting orders from member families, purchasing food directly from farmers and wholesalers, and distributing the products through a volunteer system. The complaint had been filed by several local grocery store owners who were concerned that the cooperative was operating as an unlicensed business and was competing unfairly with established commercial enterprises. They had requested that the police investigate whether the cooperative was violating business licensing requirements or tax obligations. Officer Murphy had conducted a thorough investigation of the cooperative's operations, interviewing the organizers about their procedures, reviewing their financial records, and consulting with city officials about applicable regulations. He had learned that the cooperative was structured as a non-profit organization that was exempt from many commercial licensing requirements. The cooperative's organizers had been careful to comply with health department regulations regarding food handling and storage, and they had maintained detailed records of all financial transactions. The operation was entirely volunteer-based, with no one receiving payment for their participation, and all surplus funds were used to reduce costs for member families. Officer Murphy had concluded that the cooperative was operating legally and was providing a valuable service to families who were interested in accessing alternative food sources. However, he had recommended that the organizers formalize their relationship with the city by obtaining appropriate permits and establishing clear procedures for addressing any future concerns. This case had illustrated how changing consumer preferences and economic pressures had led to new forms of cooperative organization that challenged traditional business models. Police officers had been called upon to help communities navigate these changes while maintaining fairness and protecting legitimate interests. The archives from the 1980s contained many similar examples of incidents that required officers to balance competing interests while adapting to social and economic changes. File 1986-0789 documented Officer Sarah Chun's investigation of complaints about a clothing exchange that had been organized in the Fellowship Hall of St. Mark's Church. The clothing exchange had been established to help families share children's clothing, particularly items that were quickly outgrown or needed only seasonally. Families brought clothing that their children had outgrown and were able to take other items that fit their current needs. The complaints had come from several local clothing retailers who argued that the clothing exchange was reducing their sales and was operating as an unlicensed business. They had requested that the police investigate whether the church was violating zoning regulations or tax requirements by hosting commercial activities. Officer Chun's investigation had revealed that the clothing exchange was organized entirely by volunteers and operated on a strict non-profit basis. No money changed hands, and families participated purely through the donation and sharing of items. The church provided space for the exchange as part of its community service mission. The investigation had also revealed that the clothing exchange was serving families who might not otherwise be able to afford adequate clothing for their children, particularly seasonal items like winter coats and boots that were expensive but needed only temporarily as children grew. Officer Chun had concluded that the clothing exchange did not constitute commercial activity and was clearly within the scope of charitable activities that churches were permitted to conduct. However, she had worked with the church leadership to ensure that their activities were properly documented. and that appropriate procedures were in place to address any future concerns. This case had highlighted the important role that community organizations played in addressing economic challenges facing families, and the need for flexibility in interpreting regulations to accommodate legitimate charitable activities. As Mr. Park made his way through the deeper sections of the archives, he reflected on how these files documented not just individual incidents, but the gradual evolution of community life over several decades. Each box contained stories of adaptation, conflict resolution, and social change that provided insight into how people had learned to live together despite different values, backgrounds, and goals. The physical act of maintaining these archives required constant attention to environmental conditions, pest control, and the gradual deterioration that affected all paper-based records over time. Mr. Park understood that his role extended beyond simple storage to include active preservation of materials that would become increasingly valuable as primary historical sources. In the deepest storage room, boxes contained files from the department's earliest years, documents that had been typed on manual typewriters and filed using organizational systems that had been developed when the department consisted of only a handful of officers serving a much smaller community. These oldest files had a particular fragility that required special handling procedures. The paper had become brittle with age, and the ink had faded to the point where some documents were barely legible. Mr. Park had been working with archival specialists to develop preservation strategies that would ensure these records remained accessible to future researchers. File 1943 to 0156, one of the oldest in the archives, documented an incident that had occurred during World War II when community life had been disrupted by wartime, mobilization, and the departure of many young men from military service. Officer Margaret Torres had investigated reports of lights being displayed in patterns that some residents had interpreted as possible signals to enemy forces. The investigation had revealed that the lights were being used by Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, whose son was serving overseas, as part of a personal ritual of prayer and remembrance. Every evening, she lit candles in her window in a pattern that represented her hopes for her son's safe return. Other residents had misinterpreted these lights as potentially suspicious activity and had reported them to police out of concern for community security during wartime. Officer Torres had handled the situation with great sensitivity, explaining Mrs. Walsh's activities to concerned neighbors while also ensuring that no actual security risks existed. The case had been resolved through community discussion and understanding, with neighbors expressing support for Mrs. Walsh's vigil while agreeing on procedures for distinguishing between legitimate personal activities and genuinely suspicious behavior. This file had been one of the first that Mr. Park had encountered when he began working in the archives, and it had helped him understand the important role that police officers played in maintaining community cohesion during times of stress and uncertainty. As he prepared to close the deepest storage room for the night, Mr. Park reflected on the accumulated weight of all these stories, all these carefully preserved records of human experience. The archives represented more than just administrative necessity. They were a testament to the ongoing effort to understand and respond to the full complexity of community life. Tomorrow, researchers might come seeking information about particular cases or time periods, adding to the scholarly understanding of local history and police work. Officers might reference old files to understand how similar situations had been handled in the past. Community members might seek information about events that had affected their families or neighborhoods. The endless rows of boxes and filing cabinets held answers to questions that had not yet been asked, solutions to problems that had not yet been encountered, and wisdom accumulated through decades of careful observation and documentation. In the quiet darkness of the archives, these stories waited patiently for their next readers, their next moment of relevance in the ongoing human story that continued to unfold in the streets and neighborhoods above. Asterisk. Story 4. Asterisk. Every courthouse held 1,000 verdicts in its walls. Every cell door had closed on countless stories that would never be fully told. The courthouse on Main Street stood like a monument to the community's faith in justice, its limestone facade weathered by decades of seasons, but still commanding respect from all who approached its steps. Built in 1924, the building had witnessed every significant legal proceeding in the county's modern history, from the mundane traffic violations heard in the basement courtroom to the rare, capital cases that drew spectators from neighboring towns. Detective Raymond Foster had spent countless hours in this building over the course of his 23-year career, testifying in cases he had investigated, consulting with prosecutors about evidence and procedure, and sometimes simply sitting in the back of courtrooms to observe how the legal system transformed the incidents he documented into formal judicial proceedings. The building itself seemed to absorb the weight of all these proceedings. The marble floors of the main hallway bore the smooth wear patterns created by generations of lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and families who had walked these corridors carrying their hopes and fears. The wooden benches in the courtrooms had been polished smooth by the nervous hands of people waiting for their cases to be called, their names to be spoken, their fates to be decided. Courtroom A, the largest of the building's 4 courtrooms, retained the formal dignity of an earlier era. The judge's bench rose imposingly above the rest of the room, crafted from dark walnut that had deepened with age. Behind the bench, tall windows provided natural light that changed throughout the day, casting different shadows across the American flag and the state seal that flanked the judicial seat. Detective Foster remembered particularly the case of People v. Harrison, tried in this courtroom during the autumn of 1987. Mr. Gerald Harrison had been charged with vandalism after repeatedly painting over graffiti that appeared on a wall adjacent to his business. The vandalism charge had resulted from the fact that the wall belonged to the neighboring property, making Mr. Harrison's well-intentioned cleanup efforts technically illegal. The case had attracted unusual attention because it highlighted the complex relationship between property rights, community standards, and individual initiative. Mr. Harrison had been frustrated by the repeated appearance of graffiti on the wall that was visible from his store's front window, and had taken it upon himself to paint over the markings whenever they appeared. The property owner, Ms. Dorothy Kim, had not initially objected to Mr. Harrison's cleanup efforts. However, when city officials had informed her that she could be held liable for the cost of graffiti removal under a new ordinance, she had been forced to ask Mr. Harrison to stop his unauthorized painting to avoid potential legal complications. Mr. Harrison had continued his cleanup activities despite Ms. Kim's request, leading to the vandalism charges that had brought the case to trial. The proceedings had lasted 3 days, with testimony from both parties, city officials, and numerous community members who had opinions about the appropriate response to graffiti problems. Detective Foster had testified about his investigation of the original graffiti incidents and the subsequent painting activities that had led to the charges. His testimony had focused on the factual details of what had occurred, but the courtroom proceedings had revealed the deeper community tensions that had made this seemingly simple case so complicated. The trial had concluded with a suspended sentence for Mr. Harrison, conditional on his agreement to coordinate any future cleanup activities with the property owner. The case had also led to the development of new city policies for addressing graffiti problems through cooperative efforts between property owners and community volunteers. Detective Foster had observed the entire trial from the courtroom's back row, fascinated by how the formal legal process had transformed a neighborhood dispute into a broader discussion about community responsibility and individual rights. Courtroom's formal atmosphere had provided a neutral space where all parties could present their perspectives and work toward a resolution that served everyone's interests. The basement of the courthouse housed the building's detention facilities, a series of small holding cells where people waited for their court appearances, or served short-term sentences for minor offenses. These cells, with their concrete walls and minimal furnishings, represented the stark reality that underlied the courtroom's formal proceedings. Detective Foster had brought many people to these cells over the years, mostly individuals who had been arrested for minor offenses like public intoxication, disturbing the peace, or failure to appear for court dates. The cells were not designed for long-term incarceration, but rather as temporary holding facilities for people who needed to be detained briefly while legal procedures were completed. One of the holding cells had been the temporary home of Mr. Thomas Morrison during the winter of 1989. Mr. Morrison had been arrested for trespassing after he had been discovered sleeping in the basement of the abandoned Riverside Mill. However, the circumstances of his arrest had revealed a story more complex than simple trespassing. Mr. Morrison had been a skilled machinist who had lost his job when the mill closed in 1985. Unable to find comparable employment in the area, he had gradually exhausted his savings and had eventually lost his apartment. Rather than leaving the community where he had lived for most of his adult life, Mr. Morrison had been living discreetly in various abandoned buildings, trying to remain invisible while he searched for work. The mill basement had provided shelter that was both warm and dry, and Mr. Morrison had been careful to avoid causing any damage to the property or drawing attention to his presence. He had used only a small section of the basement, had kept the area clean, and had been scrupulous about not disturbing any of the remaining equipment or supplies. Detective Foster's investigation had revealed that Mr. Morrison's situation was not unique. The economic changes that had affected the community during the 1980s had left several longtime residents in similar circumstances, struggling to maintain their connection to the community, despite financial hardships that made conventional housing unaffordable. The resolution of Mr. Morrison's case had involved cooperation between the court system, local social services, and community organizations. Rather than pursuing the trespassing charges, the prosecutor had worked with social services to connect Mr. Morrison with temporary housing assistance and job placement services. Mr. Morrison had spent only one night in the courthouse detention cell, but that brief detention had led to a comprehensive effort to address the broader issues that had created his situation. The case had highlighted the need for better coordination between law enforcement, social services, and community organizations in addressing the human consequences of economic change. The courthouse's third floor contained the offices of court personnel, including the spaces where probation officers met with people who had been sentenced to supervised release rather than incarceration. These offices, with their institutional furniture and motivational posters, represented the system's attempt to provide alternatives to imprisonment for people whose offenses were serious enough to require ongoing oversight, but not severe enough to justify removal from the community. Detective Foster had worked closely with the probation department throughout his career, providing information and assistance for cases where ongoing supervision was considered appropriate. The probation officers he had known were skilled professionals who understood that their role involved much more than simply monitoring compliance with court orders. Ms. Jennifer Walsh had served as the chief probation officer for 12 years, and her office had become a place where many community members had found the support and guidance they needed to rebuild their lives after encounters with the legal system. Ms. Walsh understood that effective probation supervision required addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to criminal behavior, not just enforcing the technical requirements of court sentences. One of the most memorable probation cases that Detective Foster had been involved with concerned Mr. Kevin Park, a young man who had been convicted of multiple counts of shoplifting from local stores. The thefts had been relatively minor in terms of monetary value, but they had occurred repeatedly over several months and had caused considerable concern among business owners. The probation supervision had lasted 18 months, during which time Mr. Park had successfully completed the treatment program, maintained steady employment, and avoided any further criminal activity. Ms. Walsh had documented his progress carefully, noting both his compliance with the technical requirements of his probation and his genuine commitment to addressing the underlying issues that had led to his problems. Detective Foster had observed Mr. Park's transformation over the course of his probation period, watching him develop the skills and support systems necessary to maintain his recovery from gambling addiction. The case had illustrated how the justice system could serve not just as a mechanism for punishment, but as a catalyst for positive change in people's lives. The county jail, located in a separate building behind the courthouse, represented the more serious end of the criminal justice spectrum. This facility, built in 1962 and expanded twice since then, housed people who had been sentenced to terms of incarceration or who were awaiting trial for serious offenses. Detective Foster had visited the jail countless times over the years, interviewing suspects, consulting with inmates who might have information about ongoing investigations, and sometimes simply maintaining contact with people he had arrested who were serving longer sentences. The jail's architecture reflected the era in which it had been built, with long corridors lined with individual cells that provided basic accommodation for inmates. The facility had been designed with security as the primary consideration, but efforts had been made over the years to create an environment that was humane and conducive to rehabilitation rather than simply punitive. One of the jail's longtime residents during the early 1990s had been Mr. Edward Santos, who had been convicted of embezzling funds from the community center where he had worked as a bookkeeper. Mr. Santos's case had been particularly troubling because he had been a trusted member of the community who had betrayed that trust for reasons that were never entirely clear. Detective Foster had investigated the embezzlement case and had found that Mr. Santos had been systematically diverting small amounts of money from the community center's accounts over a period of approximately 2 years. The amounts involved in individual transactions had been modest, but the total theft had exceeded $15,000 by the time it was discovered. The investigation had revealed that Mr. Santos had not been stealing the money to support an extravagant lifestyle or to fund any obvious vices. His personal finances were modest but stable, and he had no apparent gambling, drinking, or drug problems that might have motivated the theft. When Detective Foster had interviewed Mr. Santos after his arrest, he had struggled to provide a clear explanation for his actions. He had acknowledged the theft and had expressed remorse for his behavior, but had been unable to articulate why he had begun stealing or why he had continued the activity. For such an extended period, the case had proceeded to trial, where Mr. Santos had pleaded guilty to the embezzlement charges. The court had sentenced him to 18 months in the county jail, along with restitution requirements and community service obligations to be completed after his release. During his incarceration, Mr. Santos had participated in counseling programs designed to help him understand the psychological factors that had contributed to his criminal behavior. The jail's social worker, Ms. Lisa Rodriguez, had worked with him to explore the personal and professional pressures that might have influenced his decision-making. Detective Foster had visited Mr. Santos several times during his jail sentence, partly to gather information for other investigations, but also out of genuine curiosity about how he was coping with incarceration and what he had learned about his own motivations. These conversations had revealed that Mr. Santos's embezzlement had been connected to feelings of inadequacy and resentment that had developed over several years of working in a position where he felt undervalued and overlooked. The theft had provided him with a sense of control and power that had been missing from other aspects of his life. Mr. Santos had been released from jail after serving 14 months of his sentence and had successfully completed his probation requirements. He had found employment with a private accounting firm and had maintained a clean record for the remainder of his supervision period. The jail's role in Mr. Santos's case had extended beyond simple punishment to include opportunities for reflection, counseling, and personal growth that had helped him understand and address the underlying issues that had led to his criminal behavior. The police station itself, where Detective Foster had spent most of his career, was another building that held layers of accumulated experience within its walls. Built in 1947 and renovated several times since then, the station had served as the operational center for all police activities in the community. Building's main features reflected both the practical needs of police work and the symbolic importance of law enforcement in community life. The front desk area, where citizens came to report crimes, request assistance, or simply ask questions, had been designed to be both welcoming and secure, providing easy access for the public while maintaining appropriate safety measures for officers. Behind the public areas, the station contained the offices, meeting rooms, and specialized facilities that supported police operations. The Detective Bureau, where Detective Foster had worked for the final 8 years of his career, occupied a suite of offices on the second floor that provided space for investigators to conduct interviews, analyze evidence, and prepare case reports. The interview rooms in the Detective Bureau had been the setting for countless conversations between officers and people involved in criminal investigations. These rooms, furnished with simple tables and chairs and equipped with recording equipment, had witnessed confessions, denials, explanations, and revelations that had shaped the outcomes of hundreds of cases. Detective Foster remembered particularly a series of interviews he had conducted in Interview Room B during the investigation of a burglary ring that had operated in the community during the summer of 1993. The case had involved multiple suspects and numerous burglaries, requiring extensive coordination between different investigative teams. The interview that had broken the case open had been with Ms. Sarah Kim, a young woman who had been arrested for possession of stolen property, but who had not initially been suspected of direct involvement in the burglaries themselves. Ms. Kim had been found with several items that had been reported stolen from recent break-ins, but she had claimed that she had purchased the items from someone she knew only by his first name. Foster's interview with Ms. Kim had initially focused on identifying the person who had sold her the stolen items. However, as the conversation had continued, it had become clear that Ms. Kim knew much more about the burglary operation than she had initially admitted. The interview room's neutral environment had provided a space where Ms. Kim had gradually felt comfortable enough to reveal her actual role in the burglary ring. She had been serving as a lookout and had been helping to identify potential targets by observing the routines of residents in various neighborhoods. The information that Ms. Kim had provided during this interview had led to the arrest of 3 other individuals and the resolution of more than 20 burglary cases. However, the interview had also revealed the personal circumstances that had led Ms. Kim to become involved in criminal activity. Ms. Kim had been struggling to support herself and her young daughter after the breakdown of her marriage. She had been working part-time jobs that provided insufficient income to meet her basic needs, and had been facing eviction from her apartment when she had been recruited by the burglary ring. Detective Foster had ensured that Ms. Kim's cooperation with the investigation was considered during her sentencing, and she had received probation rather than incarceration. The case had also connected her with social services that had helped her find stable employment and housing assistance. The station's evidence storage facility, located in the basement level, represented another crucial component of police operations. This secure area contained physical evidence from hundreds of cases, carefully cataloged and preserved according to strict chain of custody procedures. Detective Foster had spent many hours in the evidence room over the years, retrieving items for court presentations, conducting additional analysis of physical evidence, and sometimes simply reviewing materials from old cases to look for connections to new investigations. The evidence room contained everything from weapons used in violent crimes to documents seized during fraud investigations to personal items recovered from burglary scenes. Each piece of evidence told part of a story, and the evidence room as a whole represented a comprehensive record of criminal activity in the community. One section of the evidence room contained items that had never been claimed by their rightful owners, property that had been recovered during investigations but never successfully returned. These unclaimed items included jewelry, electronics, tools, and personal mementos that represented losses that had never been fully resolved. Detective Foster had often wondered about the stories behind these unclaimed items. Some had obviously been stolen during burglaries and had been recovered during arrests of suspects who could not or would not identify their sources. Others had been found in suspicious circumstances that had led to investigations but had never been conclusively linked to specific crimes. The building that housed the police station also contained holding cells similar to those in the courthouse, but these were used primarily for short-term detention of people who had been arrested and were awaiting transportation to the county jail or release on bail. These cells had provided temporary housing for thousands of individuals over the years, most of whom had been arrested for minor offenses and had been released within a few hours of their booking. The cells were stark and functional, designed for safety and security rather than comfort. Detective Foster had observed that many of the people who spent time in these holding cells were dealing with problems that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of their arrest. Substance abuse, mental health issues, unemployment, and family problems often contributed to the situations that led to police encounters. The station's role in addressing these broader social issues had evolved significantly during Detective Foster's career. While law enforcement remained the primary function, officers had increasingly found themselves serving as the first point of contact between troubled individuals and the social services that might help address their underlying problems. This expanded role had required additional training and resources, as officers learned to recognize signs of mental illness, substance abuse, and other conditions that might require specialized intervention rather than traditional law enforcement responses. The buildings that housed the criminal justice system in the community represented more than just functional spaces for legal proceedings and police operations. They were symbols of the community's commitment to maintaining order and resolving conflicts through established procedures rather than through violence or chaos. Detective Foster had come to understand that these buildings held within their walls the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who had worked to create and maintain systems of justice that served the needs of the entire community. The cases that had been processed through these facilities had tested and refined legal principles, established precedents for future decisions, and demonstrated the community's capacity to adapt its institutions to changing circumstances. As he prepared for retirement, Detective Foster reflected on the thousands of hours he had spent in these buildings, the countless cases he had investigated, and the many people whose lives had been affected by their encounters with the criminal justice system. The buildings would continue to serve their essential functions long after his retirement, housing new generations of cases and continuing the ongoing work of maintaining justice and order in the community. The courthouse, jail, police station, and related facilities represented the physical infrastructure that supported one of society's most fundamental functions: the peaceful resolution of conflicts and the maintenance of public safety. Within these walls, the abstract principles of law and justice were translated into practical decisions that affected real people's lives. The buildings themselves would endure, their walls continuing to absorb the stories of future cases, their rooms continuing to provide spaces where justice could be pursued and achieved. The accumulated experience contained within these structures would continue to inform and guide those who came after, ensuring that the lessons learned from past cases would contribute to better outcomes in future situations. In the quiet hours when these buildings were empty, their corridors dark and their rooms silent, they seemed to hold within their walls the echoes of all the human drama that had played out within them. Each courtroom retained the memory of verdicts delivered. Each cell remembered the people who had occupied it. Each interview room held traces of the conversations that had taken place there. These echoes would continue to resonate, reminding future generations of the ongoing human struggle to balance individual rights with collective security, to distinguish between justice and vengeance, and to maintain hope for redemption, even in the face of human failing and tragedy. Story 5. In every crime report, between the lines of testimony and evidence, lived the invisible threads that connected one neighbor to another, one family to the next. The neighborhoods that surrounded the police station spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each street carrying its own rhythm, its own collection of families who had chosen to make their lives in this particular place. Lieutenant Maria Santos had walked these streets for 15 years, first as a patrol officer and later as a community liaison, learning the subtle patterns that connected households, the invisible networks of relationship and responsibility that held the community together. Maple Street ran east from the downtown area, lined with modest two-story houses built mostly in the 1940s and 1950s, when returning veterans had used government loans to establish homes for their growing families. These houses had weathered gracefully, their front porches and small yards creating natural spaces where neighbors could encounter each other during the ordinary routines of daily life. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson had lived at 247 Maple Street for 38 years, raising 4 children in the house, where she had moved as a young bride in 1956. Her kitchen window provided a clear view of the street, and over the decades she had developed an intimate knowledge of the patterns that governed her neighborhood's daily life. Lieutenant Santos had first met Mrs. Henderson during the investigation of a series of package thefts that had occurred on Maple Street during the holiday season of 1991. Someone had been taking packages from front porches during the day, when most residents were at work and unable to accept deliveries personally. The thefts had seemed random at first, affecting different houses without any apparent pattern. However, Mrs. Henderson's observations had revealed a more complex story. From her kitchen window, she had noticed that the thefts only occurred on days when Mr. James Kim, who lived 3 houses down, was away from home during his usual lunch break. Mr. Kim worked a shift that allowed him to return home briefly each day around noon, and his presence on the street during that time had apparently been enough to deter the package thief. When Mr. Kim had been required to work through lunch due to increased holiday demand at his workplace, the thefts had resumed. Mrs. Henderson had also observed that the thief appeared to be familiar with the neighborhood's patterns, taking packages only from houses where the residents were reliably absent during specific hours. The person seemed to understand which families had young children who napped in the afternoons, which residents worked standard business hours, and which houses remained empty during the day. Lieutenant Santos's investigation had revealed that the package thief was Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, a single mother who lived on the adjacent street and was struggling to provide Christmas gifts for her 3 children. Mrs. Walsh had been unemployed for several months and had been facing eviction from her apartment when she had begun taking the packages. The resolution of the case had involved the entire neighborhood rather than just the criminal justice system. Mrs. Henderson had organized an effort to collect donations and volunteer assistance for Mrs. Walsh and her children, ensuring that they could remain in their home and that the children would have gifts for Christmas. Mrs. Walsh had made restitution for the stolen packages and had performed community service rather than facing criminal charges. She had also found employment through connections made during the neighborhood's assistance effort and had eventually become an active participant in community activities. This case had illustrated how crime often emerged from social isolation and economic desperation, and how community responses could address underlying problems rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. Mrs. Henderson's careful observations had been crucial not only in solving the case, but in understanding the circumstances that had created it. The network of relationships that connected the families on Maple Street extended beyond simple geographic proximity to include shared experiences, mutual obligations, and collective memories that had been built up over years of living in close proximity to each other. Mr. Edward Park, who lived at 253 Maple Street, had served as an informal neighborhood coordinator for emergency situations ever since. He had retired from his job as a telephone company supervisor in 1987. His technical skills and calm temperament had made him the person that neighbors called when they needed help with problems that required both practical knowledge and careful judgment. Lieutenant Santos had worked with Mr. Park on several occasions when neighborhood situations had required police involvement, but had also benefited from community expertise and leadership. Mr. Park's understanding of local personalities and relationships had often provided insight that helped officers develop appropriate responses to complex situations. One such situation had occurred during the summer of 1994, when a dispute between two families had escalated to the point where police intervention had become necessary. The conflict had begun as a disagreement about property boundaries, but had gradually expanded to include grievances about noise, parking, and children's behavior that had been accumulating for several years. The families involved, the Johnsons and the Torreses, had been neighbors for more than a decade, but had developed incompatible approaches to maintaining their adjacent properties. The Johnsons preferred a more formal landscaping style and were particular about keeping their yard neat and orderly. The Torreses had a more relaxed approach and allowed their children to use the yard as a play area. The immediate trigger for the dispute had been the installation of a fence that may have encroached slightly on the Torres property. However, Lieutenant Santos's investigation had revealed that the fence was merely the latest manifestation of long-standing tensions that had never been directly addressed by the families involved. Mr. Park had been instrumental in helping to resolve the conflict by organizing a series of informal meetings where both families could express their concerns and work toward mutually acceptable solutions. His approach had focused on identifying common interests rather than assigning blame for past grievances. The resolution had involved minor adjustments to the fence placement, agreements about noise levels and children's activities, and the establishment of regular communication between the families to prevent similar conflicts in the future. The police department's role had been to ensure that the discussions remained civil and productive, rather than to impose a solution from outside. This type of community-based conflict resolution had become increasingly important as Lieutenant Santos had gained experience in dealing with neighborhood disputes. Many conflicts that initially appeared to require law enforcement intervention could be more effectively addressed through mediation and community problem-solving. The relationships between families on Maple Street were further complicated by the presence of multiple generations who had different perspectives on neighborhood life and different expectations about privacy, community involvement, and mutual responsibility. Mrs. Susan Kim, who had moved to 251 Maple Street in 1989 with her husband and young children, had initially struggled to understand the informal protocols that governed neighborhood interactions. She had grown up in an urban area where anonymity was more common and where neighbors maintained more distance from each other's daily lives. The adjustment to Maple Street's more connected community style had been challenging for Mrs. Kim, who had valued her privacy and had been uncomfortable with the level of mutual awareness that characterized the neighborhood. However, a crisis situation had helped her understand the benefits of living in a place where neighbors paid attention to each other's welfare. During the winter of 1993, Mrs. Kim's youngest child had become seriously ill with a respiratory infection that had developed rapidly during the night. Mrs. Kim's husband had been out of town on business, and she had found herself alone with a child who needed immediate medical attention during a snowstorm that had made driving dangerous. Mrs. Henderson, observing unusual activity at the Kim house from her kitchen window, had recognized that something was wrong and had contacted Mr. Park to ask if help was needed. Mr. Park had arranged for several neighbors to assist with transportation to the hospital and care for Mrs. Kim's other children during the emergency. The community response to this crisis had helped Mrs. Kim understand that the neighborhood's informal monitoring system was not intrusive surveillance, but rather a safety net that could provide crucial assistance when unexpected problems arose. She had gradually become more comfortable with neighborhood social patterns and had eventually become an active participant in community activities. Lieutenant Santos had observed that many newcomers to established neighborhoods went through similar adjustment periods as they learned to balance their desire for privacy with the benefits of community connection. The most successful adaptations occurred when longtime residents were patient with newcomers, and when new residents were willing to gradually increase their participation in neighborhood life. The children who grew up on Maple Street created their own networks of relationship that both reflected and influenced the connections between their families. The neighborhood's sidewalks, yards, and informal gathering spaces provided venues where children from different households could interact regularly and develop friendships that often lasted well beyond their childhood years. These childhood connections sometimes created complications for law enforcement when minor incidents occurred that involved multiple families with complex histories of relationship and cooperation. Lieutenant Santos had learned to pay careful attention to these family connections when investigating cases that involved young people, as the social dynamics were often more important than the immediate legal issues. A case from the spring of 1995 had illustrated these complexities. 3 teenagers from Maple Street had been arrested for vandalism after they had spray-painted graffiti on the walls of the elementary school playground. The vandalism itself was straightforward, but the relationships between the teenagers and their families had made the case much more complicated. The 3 young people involved were Tommy Johnson, Maria Torres, and Kevin Kim, all of whom had grown up together on Maple Street and whose families had been neighbors for many years. Their vandalism had occurred during a period when all 3 were dealing with various personal and family stresses that had affected their behavior and judgment. Tommy Johnson's parents were going through a difficult divorce that had created tension throughout the Johnson household. Maria Torres had been struggling academically and had been concerned about her ability to graduate her class. Kevin Kim had been dealing with pressure from his parents to excel in school while also helping to care for his elderly grandmother who had moved in with the family. The Paz's vandalism had been a spontaneous act that had occurred when the 3 teenagers had been walking together after a particularly stressful day at school. None of them had previous records of criminal activity, and all were generally considered to be responsible young people who had made a poor decision during a difficult period. Lieutenant Santos's investigation had revealed that the graffiti itself was not malicious or offensive, but rather consisted of artistic designs that the teenagers had been practicing as part of an informal art club. However, the location of the vandalism on school property had made it a serious matter that required official response. The resolution of the case had involved extensive consultation with the families, school officials, and community members who knew the teenagers and their circumstances. Rather than pursuing formal charges, the prosecutor had agreed to a community service arrangement that allowed the young people to use their artistic skills to create authorized murals in other locations. Teenagers had spent the summer working together to paint a mural on the side of the community center, a project that had been supervised by a local artist and had been enthusiastically supported by neighborhood residents. The experience had helped them develop their artistic abilities while also providing a constructive outlet for the stress they had been experiencing. Case had demonstrated how community knowledge and relationships could inform appropriate responses to juvenile crime that addressed underlying problems rather than simply imposing punishment. The long-term relationships between the families involved had provided foundation for collaborative problem solving that might not have been available in other circumstances. The elderly residents of Maple Street represented a particularly important component of the neighborhood's social fabric, as they provided both institutional memory and ongoing community leadership despite their reduced physical capabilities. Lieutenant Santos had learned that these older residents often possessed crucial information about neighborhood patterns and relationships that could be invaluable during investigations. Mr. Thomas Walsh, who had lived at 249 Maple Street since 1954, had served as an informal neighborhood historian who could provide context for current events by explaining how similar situations had been handled in the past. His memory of previous residents, family relationships, and community conflicts often provided insight that helped Lieutenant Santos understand the background of contemporary problems during the investigation of a series of garden thefts that had occurred in the summer of 1996. Mr. Walsh's historical knowledge had been crucial in identifying patterns that connected the current incidents to similar problems that had occurred in previous decades. His understanding of seasonal patterns, family traditions, and neighborhood customs had helped Lieutenant Santos develop effective strategies for addressing the thefts. The garden thefts had involved the systematic removal of vegetables and flowers from backyard gardens throughout the neighborhood. The thefts had been carefully planned and executed, with the perpetrator taking only ripe produce and mature flowers while leaving younger plants undisturbed. Mr. Walsh had remembered that similar thefts had occurred during the 1970s and had been resolved when the community had discovered that the thief was an elderly resident who had been too proud to ask for help with food costs but had been struggling to maintain adequate nutrition on a fixed income. This historical perspective had led Lieutenant Santos to investigate whether the current thefts might be motivated by similar circumstances. Her inquiry had revealed that Mrs. Lisa Rodriguez, a widow who had moved to the neighborhood recently, had been experiencing financial difficulties that had made it hard for her to afford fresh produce on her limited budget. Mrs. Rodriguez had been taking vegetables and flowers not for malicious reasons, but because she had been trying to maintain the kind of diet that her doctor had recommended for managing her diabetes. She had been too embarrassed to ask for help and had convinced herself that taking small amounts from multiple gardens would not cause significant harm to any individual family. The resolution had involved connecting Mrs. Rodriguez with community resources that could help with her financial situation, as well as organizing a neighborhood sharing system for garden produce that allowed all residents to benefit from each other's gardening efforts. Mr. Walsh's historical perspective had been crucial in understanding that the thefts were symptoms of social isolation and economic hardship rather than simple criminal behavior. His knowledge of how similar situations had been addressed in the past had provided a model for community-based solutions that addressed underlying problems. The informal networks of mutual assistance that characterized Maple Street had evolved over decades of shared experience and had created systems of support that operated largely outside of official institutions. Lieutenant Santos had observed that these informal systems were often more effective than formal social services in addressing the day-to-day challenges that residents faced. Mrs. Carol Park, who had lived at 255 Maple Street since 1978, had gradually become the neighborhood's unofficial coordinator for assistance to families dealing with temporary crises. Her role had evolved naturally from her willingness to help neighbors with childcare during emergencies, and had expanded to include organizing meal trains for families with new babies or sick relatives, coordinating transportation for elderly residents who could no longer drive, and maintaining an informal lending library of tools and household items. Lieutenant Santos had worked with Mrs. Park on several occasions when police investigations had revealed that families were dealing with problems that extended beyond the immediate criminal justice issues. Mrs. Park's knowledge of available resources and her ability to mobilize community support had often been crucial in developing comprehensive solutions to complex problems. A case from the fall of 1997 had illustrated the importance of these informal support networks. Mrs. Sarah Torres, a single mother who lived at 258 Maple Street, had been arrested for shoplifting groceries from the local supermarket. The arrest had occurred during a period when she had been struggling to feed her 3 children while waiting for her application for public assistance to be processed. Lieutenant Santos's investigation had revealed that Mrs. Torres had been too proud to ask her neighbors for help, despite the fact that several families on Maple Street had excess food from their gardens and would have been willing to share. The arrest had created additional problems by threatening Mrs. Torres's employment and potentially affecting her custody of her children. Mrs. Park had intervened to organize comprehensive support for Mrs. Torres and her family, including temporary financial assistance, help with navigating the public assistance application process, and ongoing emotional support during a difficult period. The community response had been so effective that Mrs. Torres had been able to avoid criminal prosecution and had eventually achieved financial stability. This case had demonstrated how crime could sometimes be prevented through early intervention and community support, and how formal law enforcement responses could be complemented by informal community assistance. Mrs. Park's leadership had been crucial in mobilizing resources and ensuring that the family's needs were addressed comprehensively. The children's informal networks on Maple Street often served as early warning systems that could alert adults to developing problems before they became serious enough to require police intervention. Lieutenant Santos had learned to pay attention to information that came through these children's networks, as young people often observed things that adults missed and were sometimes more willing to share information about concerning situations. The neighborhood's teenagers had developed their own informal code of conduct that included expectations about when problems should be reported to adults and when they should be handled within their peer group. Understanding these informal systems had been important for Lieutenant Santos in developing effective approaches to juvenile issues. During the summer of 1998, the Teenage Network on Maple Street had provided crucial information about a situation that could have developed into a serious problem. Several young people had observed that Danny Morrison, a 16-year-old who lived on the adjacent street, had been displaying increasingly erratic behavior and had been talking about harming himself. The teenagers had initially attempted to handle the situation themselves by providing emotional support and encouraging Danny to talk to adults about his problems. However, when his behavior had become more concerning, they had decided to involve adults despite their usual preference for handling peer problems independently. The information had reached Lieutenant Santos through the informal network that connected teenage concerns to adult awareness, and she had been able to arrange for appropriate mental health intervention before Danny's situation had reached a crisis point. The early intervention had been successful in connecting Danny with professional help and preventing a potential tragedy. This case had illustrated the importance of maintaining good relationships between law enforcement and the informal networks that operated within the community. The teenagers' willingness to share information had been based on their trust that adults would respond appropriately and that their friend would receive help rather than punishment. The families on Maple Street represented multiple generations of residents who had different perspectives on community life, but who shared a commitment to maintaining the neighborhood's character as a place where people looked out for each other. Lieutenant Santos had observed that this multi-generational continuity provided stability during periods of change and helped new residents understand the expectations and opportunities that came with living in a connected community. The physical spaces of the neighborhood, from front porches to backyard gardens to sidewalks where children played, provided venues for the countless small interactions that built and maintained the relationships between families. Lieutenant Santos had come to understand that these informal meeting places were as important to community safety as formal law enforcement activities, because they created opportunities for neighbors to know each other well enough to recognize when something was wrong. The patterns of daily life on Maple Street, from morning routines to evening activities, created a rhythm that residents could use to monitor each other's welfare without intrusiveness. This natural surveillance system was more effective than any formal security program because it was based on genuine concern and personal relationships rather than fear or suspicion. As Lieutenant Santos reflected on her years of working with the Maple Street community, she understood that effective policing required much more than responding to criminal incidents. It required building relationships with community networks, understanding the informal systems that connected neighbors to each other, and recognizing that crime prevention often involved supporting the social connections that helped people solve problems before they became police matters. The threads that connected one family to another on Maple Street were invisible but strong, woven from years of shared experience, mutual assistance, and genuine care for each other's welfare. These connections created a foundation of community safety that no formal law enforcement program could replicate, and they represented the best hope for preventing crime and building the kind of neighborhood where families could thrive. In the quiet evening hours when Maple Street settled into its nighttime rhythm, the lights in kitchen windows created a constellation of homes where families were living their daily lives in proximity to neighbors who knew their names, understood their circumstances, and stood ready to help when assistance was needed. This network of connection and care represented the true foundation of community safety, and it continued to operate long after the police officers had completed their shifts and returned to their own neighborhoods. Story 6. Asterisk. The station after midnight belonged to a different world, where time moved slower and every sound carried further through the empty corridors. Officer David Chun had walked the night shift for 12 years, and he understood that darkness transformed not just the appearance of the city, but its entire character. The streets that bustled with activity during daylight hours took on a contemplative quality after sunset, their familiar landmarks softened by the amber glow of streetlights and the occasional sweep of headlights from passing cars. The police station during the night shift operated with a skeleton crew of 3 officers, 1 dispatcher, and a desk sergeant who managed the steady flow of paperwork that continued regardless of the hour. The building itself seemed to settle into a different rhythm after the day shift departed. the fluorescent lights humming more quietly, the radio chatter more subdued. The very air carrying a sense of watchful calm. Sergeant Patricia Walsh had supervised the night shift for 8 years, and she had developed an appreciation for the unique perspective that these hours provided on community life. The incidents that occurred between midnight and dawn were often different in character from those that demanded attention during the busier daylight hours, requiring a more contemplative approach to problem solving and a deeper understanding of human nature. The dispatch desk during the night shift was operated by Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez, whose calm voice had guided officers through countless situations over her 15-year career. The radio traffic during these hours was lighter, but often more complex, as the calls that came in frequently involved people dealing with personal crises that had been building for hours, or days before finally requiring police intervention. The clock on the station wall marked the slow passage of time with a steady tick that became more noticeable in the relative quiet of the night hours. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the station often fell into periods of complete silence, broken only by the occasional radio call or the sound of Officer Chun's footsteps as he conducted his routine patrols through the downtown area. File 1992-1847 documented a case that had unfolded during one of these quiet periods in early autumn. Officer Chun had received a call from Mrs. Susan Kim, who lived alone in an apartment above the downtown bakery. She had reported hearing footsteps in the shop below her living space, but when she had looked out her window, she had seen no signs of forced entry and no vehicles parked outside that might indicate the presence of intruders. Officer Chun had arrived at the bakery to find the building secure, with all doors and windows properly locked and showing no signs of disturbance. However, Mrs. Kim had insisted that she had heard deliberate movement in the shop below, and her obvious distress had convinced Officer Chun to investigate further, using keys provided by the bakery owner. Officer Chun had conducted a thorough search of the shop's interior. The bakery equipment was all in its proper place. The cash register was undisturbed, and there were no signs that anyone had been inside the building since closing time. However, Officer Chun's investigation had revealed something unexpected. In the shop's main display area, someone had arranged several loaves of bread and pastries into an elaborate pattern that resembled a mandala or decorative flower. The arrangement was beautiful and clearly intentional, but it had definitely not been left that way by the bakery staff when they had closed the shop. Further investigation had revealed that the bakery's owner, Mr. James Park, had been giving keys to Mrs. Dorothy Santos, an elderly woman who had been struggling with insomnia and had found that the quiet, familiar environment of the bakery helped her feel calm during the late night hours when she could not sleep. That Mrs. Santos had been visiting the bakery several nights each week, not to take anything, but simply to sit quietly in the space where she had worked for 20 years before her retirement. The bread arrangements had been her way of creating something beautiful during these peaceful hours, a form of meditation that helped her cope with the loneliness and restlessness that had troubled her since her husband's death. The resolution of the case had involved a conversation between Officer Chun, Mr. Park, Mrs. Santos, and Mrs. Kim, resulting in an arrangement that allowed Mrs. Santos to continue her nighttime visits while ensuring that Mrs. Kim was aware of the situation and comfortable with the activity taking place below her apartment. This case had illustrated the complex ways that people coped with grief, loneliness, and other personal challenges during the quiet hours when conventional sources of support were not available. Officer Chun had documented not just the immediate incident, but also the creative solution that had allowed Mrs. Santos to find comfort while addressing Mrs. Kim's legitimate security concerns. The night shift often brought calls that revealed the hidden struggles of community members who maintained normal appearances during daylight hours but dealt with significant challenges when the support systems of family, work, and social connections were not readily available. File 199-40321 had documented Officer Chun's response to a call about suspicious activity at the elementary school playground. The caller, Mr. Edward Morrison, had been walking his dog and had observed someone moving around the playground equipment in what appeared to be a purposeful but unauthorized manner. Officer Chun had found Mr. Thomas Walsh, a middle-aged man who worked as a night shift custodian at the hospital, cleaning and maintaining the playground equipment with supplies he had brought from his own home. Mr. Walsh had been systematically checking each piece of equipment for safety hazards, tightening bolts, cleaning surfaces, and making minor repairs. When Officer Chun had interviewed Mr. Walsh about his unauthorized maintenance activities, he had learned that Mr. Walsh's own children had attended the elementary school many years earlier, and that he had maintained an emotional connection to the playground where they had spent countless hours during their childhood. Mr. Walsh had recently learned that budget cuts were affecting the school district's ability to maintain playground equipment properly, and he had been concerned about the safety of current students who used the facilities. His nighttime maintenance activities had been his way of ensuring that the playground remained safe for children. Using skills and supplies from his professional custodial work, the case had been resolved through coordination between Officer Chun, school officials, and Mr. Walsh, resulting in a formal volunteer arrangement that allowed him to contribute his expertise while following proper procedures for access to school property. Officer Chun had documented this resolution as an example of community problem solving that addressed both security concerns and genuine civic engagement. Mr. Walsh's unauthorized activity had been motivated by legitimate concern for child safety, and the formal arrangement had allowed him to continue contributing to the community while operating within appropriate guidelines. The radio calls that came in during the night shift often involved domestic situations where family tensions had escalated over the course of the evening and had reached the point where outside intervention was necessary to prevent more serious problems from developing. Sergeant Walsh had developed particular expertise in handling these domestic calls, understanding that successful resolution often required patience, careful listening, and the ability to help family members find ways to de-escalate conflicts without criminally prosecuting behavior that arose from stress and poor communication, rather than malicious intent. File 199508892 had documented one such case, where Sergeant Walsh had responded to a call about a loud argument between spouses at a house on Pine Street. Mrs. Jennifer Torres had called to report that her neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. David Kim, were engaged in a heated dispute that had been ongoing for several hours and had become loud enough to disturb the entire block. When Sergeant Walsh had arrived at the Kim residence, she had found a couple who were exhausted from arguing but were committed to working through their disagreement rather than simply ending their discussion. The argument had concerned financial decisions that needed to be made regarding Mr. Kim's elderly mother, who required increasing levels of care but was resistant to accepting help. The dispute had escalated not because of any fundamental disagreement between the spouses, but because both were stressed and tired from dealing with a difficult situation that had no easy solutions. Their argument had continued for hours because neither felt that their concerns were being fully understood by the other. Sergeant Walsh's intervention had focused on helping the couple structure their discussion in a more productive way, ensuring that each person had opportunities to express their concerns without interruption and encouraging them to focus on identifying options rather than assigning blame for the difficulties they were facing. The resolution had not involved any criminal charges or formal police action, but rather had provided the couple with communication tools that helped them work through their disagreement. and develop a plan for addressing Mr. Kim's mother's care needs. Sergeant Walsh had documented this case as an example of community policing that addressed underlying social stresses rather than simply responding to surface behaviors. The couple's argument had been a symptom of their struggle to balance competing obligations and limited resources, and effective police intervention had helped them develop better strategies for handling similar challenges in the future. The night shift also brought calls from people dealing with mental health crises that had developed or intensified during the isolation of the evening hours. These calls required particular sensitivity and often involved coordination with mental health professionals and social services that operated emergency response programs. File 1996-1134 had documented Officer Chun's response to a call from Mr. Kevin Park, who had contacted the police because he was concerned about his neighbor, Mrs. Lisa Rodriguez. Mrs. Rodriguez had been standing in her backyard for several hours, apparently talking to people who were not visible to observers. Officer Chun had approached Mrs. Rodriguez carefully, finding her engaged in what appeared to be animated conversations with family members who had died several years earlier. She was not agitated or dangerous, but she was clearly experiencing a psychological episode that had disconnected her from present reality. Mrs. Rodriguez had been cooperative when Officer Chun had spoken with her, but she had been unable to understand that the people she was talking with were not actually present. She had been concerned that her visitors would be offended if she stopped talking with them to focus on Officer Chun's questions. The situation had required careful coordination between Officer Chun, Emergency Mental Health Services, and Mrs. Rodriguez's adult daughter, who lived in another state but was contacted to provide information about her mother's medical history and support system. The resolution had involved transportation to the hospital for evaluation and treatment, but the process had been managed in a way that respected Mrs. Rodriguez's dignity and avoided traumatizing her during a period when she was already experiencing significant confusion and distress. Officer Chun had documented this case as an example of the specialized skills that police officers needed for handling mental health emergencies, and he had included recommendations for additional training and resources that could improve the department's ability to respond appropriately to similar situations. The businesses that remained open during the night shift created small islands of activity in the otherwise quiet downtown area. Officer Chun's regular patrols included visits to these establishments, both to ensure their security and to maintain connections with business owners and employees who comprised an important part of the community's nighttime population. The all-night diner on Main Street had served as an informal community center for night shift workers, insomniacs, and others who found themselves awake during the hours when most of the city slept. Officer Chun had frequently stopped at the diner during his patrols, developing relationships with regular customers and staff members who provided valuable information about patterns and changes in nighttime activity. File 1997045 had documented an incident that had occurred at the diner during a particularly quiet Tuesday night in February. Officer Chun had received a call from the diner's night manager, Miss Carol Walsh, who reported that a customer had been sitting in the same booth for more than 6 hours without ordering any food and had not responded to staff attempts to communicate with him. Officer Chun had found Mr. Thomas Santos sitting motionless in a corner booth, staring out the window with an expression of profound sadness, but showing no signs of physical distress or intoxication. Mr. Santos had been responsive when Officer Chun had spoken with him, but he had seemed disconnected from his surroundings and uncertain about how much time had passed. The investigation had revealed that Mr. Santos had recently received news that his adult son had been killed in an automobile accident in another state. Mr. Santos had been unable to afford travel to attend the funeral, and he had been struggling to process his grief while dealing with the practical challenges of his son's death. Mr. Santos had come to the diner not because he was hungry, but because he had been unable to tolerate being alone in his apartment with his grief. The diner's warm lighting and quiet activity had provided a comforting environment where he could sit with his thoughts without feeling completely isolated. The resolution had involved connecting Mr. Santos with grief counseling services and community resources that could provide practical assistance with his son's affairs. The diner staff had also arranged to provide him with meals during the difficult period immediately following his loss. Officer Chun had documented this case as an example of how businesses that remained open during night hours often served important social functions beyond their commercial purposes, providing spaces where isolated community members could find human connection during difficult periods. The industrial areas of the city that operated during night shifts created their own patterns of activity that required police attention and understanding. The manufacturing plants, delivery services, and other businesses that functioned during these hours employed workers whose schedules and concerns were different from those of the daytime community. Officer Chun had developed relationships with security guards, supervisors, and workers at these facilities, understanding that their cooperation was essential for maintaining security and responding effectively to incidents that occurred in industrial areas during the night shift. File 1998-0789 had documented an investigation into a series of thefts from delivery trucks that had been parked at loading docks throughout the industrial district. The thefts had been carefully planned and executed, with the perpetrator taking only small, valuable items that would not be immediately missed from large shipments. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that the thefts had occurred at different facilities over several weeks, and the pattern had only become apparent when Officer Chun had compared incident reports from multiple businesses. The night shift workers at various facilities had provided crucial information about suspicious activity they had observed. The case had been solved when Mr. Frank Kim, a security guard at one of the affected facilities, had recognized the person responsible as someone who had previously worked in the delivery industry and was familiar with the routines and procedures used at various loading docks. The perpetrator had been Mr. James Morrison, a former delivery driver who had lost his job due to budget cuts and had been using his knowledge of the industry to target shipments that were vulnerable to theft. His familiarity with loading dock procedures had allowed him to access trucks without arousing immediate suspicion. The resolution had involved criminal charges for the thefts, but the case had also highlighted the economic pressures that had contributed to Mr. Morrison's criminal behavior. The investigation had revealed that he had been unable to find comparable employment after losing his delivery job and had been facing eviction and other financial crises. Officer Chun had documented this case as an example of how economic instability could lead to criminal behavior among people who had previously been law-abiding citizens. The case had also demonstrated the importance of maintaining good relationships with night shift workers who could provide valuable information about suspicious activities. The residential areas during the night shift presented their own unique challenges and opportunities for community policing. Officer Chun's patrols through neighborhoods during the quiet hours allowed him to observe patterns and changes that might not be apparent during the busier daytime periods. The night shift provided opportunities for more extended conversations with residents who were awake during these hours, including people dealing with insomnia, shift workers returning home, and parents caring for young children who kept irregular sleep schedules. File 1999-1023 had documented Officer Chun's investigation of reports about a person who had been observed walking through residential areas during the early morning hours, apparently checking car doors and looking into parked vehicles. The investigation had revealed that the person was Mrs. Dorothy Park, an elderly woman who had developed a compulsive routine of checking that cars in her neighborhood were properly secured. Mrs. Park had been concerned about vehicle break-ins after reading about crime in other areas, and she had convinced herself that she was helping to protect her neighbor's property. Mrs. Park's behavior had been well-intentioned, but had understandably concerned residents who had observed her checking their vehicles without permission. Her activities had also potentially created liability issues if she had accidentally damaged any vehicles during her security checks. The resolution had involved connecting Mrs. Park with mental health services that could help her address the anxiety that was driving her compulsive behavior, while also organizing a formal neighborhood watch program that could channel her security concerns into more appropriate activities. Officer Chun had documented this case as an example of how community members' attempts to help could sometimes create problems if they were not coordinated with official security efforts and appropriate social services. The paperwork that accumulated during the night shift reflected the different character of incidents that occurred during these hours. The reports were often more detailed and contemplative than those filed during busier periods, as officers had more time to observe situations thoroughly and to document the complex social and psychological factors that contributed to nighttime incidents. Sergeant Walsh had observed that night shift. Officers often developed deeper insights into the community's social dynamics because they encountered people during vulnerable moments, when normal social barriers were reduced and authentic concerns were more likely to surface. The night shift also provided opportunities for officers to engage in community problem-solving, activities that were difficult to pursue during busier periods. Officer Chun had used quiet periods during his patrols to visit with business owners, check on elderly residents who lived alone, and maintain relationships with community members who might provide valuable information about developing problems. The station itself during the night shift took on characteristics that reflected the contemplative nature of these hours. The coffee pot in the break room worked overtime, the radio traffic created a steady background rhythm, and the fluorescent lights cast steady shadows that remained unchanged for hours at a time. The files and reports generated during the night shift would eventually join the thousands of documents already stored in the archives, adding to the accumulated record of human experience that the police department maintained. Each incident documented during these quiet hours represented someone's encounter with law enforcement during a moment when normal social support systems were less available. As the night shift approached its end and the first signs of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky, Officer Chun would complete his final patrol through the downtown area, checking that the businesses and public spaces had remained secure through another peaceful night. The transition from night shift to day shift marked not just a change in personnel, but a transformation in the city's entire character. The streets that had been quiet and contemplative during the night hours would soon fill with the activity of morning commuters, school children, and business operations resuming their daily routines. The incidents and observations from the night shift would be documented in reports that would be reviewed by day shift supervisors, adding to the continuous flow of information that helped the police department understand and respond to the community's evolving needs and challenges. In the quiet moments just before dawn, when the night shift's work was nearly complete and the city was beginning to stir with the first hints of morning activity, the police station held within its walls the accumulated stories of another night's worth of human experience, carefully documented and preserved as part of the ongoing record of community life. The night shift officers understood that their work involved more than simply responding to criminal incidents. They served as guardians of the community's peace during the hours when people were most vulnerable and when the normal support systems of family, work, and social connections were least available. Their careful documentation of nighttime incidents provided insights into human nature and community, dynamics that would inform police work for years to come, contributing to the accumulated wisdom that helped officers understand how to serve and protect a community that never truly slept, but only changed its rhythm as darkness gave way to dawn. Story 7. The evidence room held more than just proof of crimes. It held fragments of lives interrupted, moments frozen in time when ordinary days became something else entirely. Detective Susan Martinez had always been drawn to the photograph collections stored in the evidence room's climate-controlled cabinets. These images, taken at crime scenes during investigations and as part of routine documentation, represented a visual history of the community that extended far beyond their original purpose as legal evidence. Each photograph captured not just the immediate subject of police attention, but also the background details that revealed how people lived, worked, and arranged their daily lives during different eras. The oldest photographs in the collection dated back to the 1940s, when the department had first begun systematically documenting crime scenes and evidence. These black and white images had a formal quality that reflected both the photographic technology of the era and the more ritualized approach to police work that had characterized law enforcement in the post-war period. File photograph 1947-0156A showed the interior of Henderson's General Store after a burglary that had occurred during the winter of 1947. The image captured not just the overturned cash register and scattered merchandise that had prompted the police response, but also the careful arrangement of goods that revealed the store's role as a civic community gathering place where practical necessities and social interaction had been seamlessly combined. The photograph showed wooden shelves lined with canned goods, bolts of fabric, hand tools, and household items arranged with the kind of attention to display that suggested the store owner had taken pride in creating an environment that was both functional and welcoming. Behind the counter, a hand-lettered sign advertised credit terms for regular customers, reflecting the personal relationships that had characterized small-town commerce during this era. Detective Martinez had often studied this photograph during quiet moments in the evidence room, fascinated by the glimpse it provided into a way of life that had largely disappeared from the community by the time she had joined the police force. The store had eventually been replaced by larger retail establishments that offered more selection but less personal connection between merchants and customers. The burglary itself had been solved within a week, when Officer Robert Hayes had arrested Mr. Frank Morrison, a young man who had recently returned from military service and had been struggling to find employment that provided adequate income for his growing family. The stolen items had been recovered and returned to the store, and Mr. Morrison had eventually found steady work through connections made during the court proceedings that had resolved his case. But the photograph had preserved a moment in the community's commercial history that extended far beyond the immediate criminal investigation. The image documented the physical environment where residents had conducted their daily business, the social relationships that had been built around commercial transactions, and the economic conditions that had shaped how people met their material needs. Photograph 1952-0893B had captured the scene of a traffic accident that had occurred at the intersection of Main Street and Elm Avenue during the spring of 1952. The black and white image showed two automobiles that had collided during what appeared to be a minor fender bender, but the background details revealed a streetscape that had been dramatically different from the contemporary community. The photograph showed a downtown area lined with locally owned businesses whose hand-painted signs advertised services that reflected the economic activities of the 1950s. A blacksmith shop, a millinery store, a radio repair service, and a pharmacy with a soda fountain. The sidewalks were populated with pedestrians whose clothing and posture suggested a more formal approach to public appearance than would be common in later decades. The automobiles involved in the accident were large, heavy vehicles with chrome detailing and rounded edges that represented the automotive design philosophy of the early 1950s. The drivers, visible in the photograph as they examined the minor damage to their vehicles, were dressed in suits and hats that indicated the accident had occurred during business hours when professional attire was expected even for routine activities. Detective Martinez had used this photograph during community presentations about traffic safety, not just to illustrate historical changes in vehicle design and safety features, but to highlight how the physical environment of the downtown area had evolved over the decades. The businesses visible in the background had long since been replaced by different establishments that served the changing needs of the community's economy and population. The accident itself had been resolved without serious injury or significant property damage, but the photograph had preserved a comprehensive view of the community's commercial and social landscape during a period of significant change following the end of World War II. The photographic collection from the 1960s reflected both technological improvements in camera equipment and changing approaches to crime scene documentation. The images from this era were more numerous and detailed than those from earlier decades, as the department had recognized the increasing importance of visual evidence in criminal investigations and court proceedings. Photograph 1965-0445C had documented the scene of a vandalism incident at the new high school that had been constructed to accommodate the community's growing population of baby boom children. The image showed graffiti that had been spray painted on the school's brick exterior walls, but the content of the vandalism had been unlike the typical property damage that characterized most such incidents. The graffiti had consisted of elaborate artistic designs that incorporated peace symbols, flower motifs, and inspirational quotes from literature and philosophy. The messages had been clearly influenced by the counterculture movements that were gaining prominence during the mid-1960s, but they had been executed with skill and creativity that suggested serious, artistic intent rather than simple destructive behavior. The photograph had captured not just the graffiti itself, but also the architectural features of the school building that represented the community's investment in modern educational facilities. The clean lines and large windows of the new building had reflected contemporary design philosophy that emphasized openness, natural light, and the importance of creating environments that would inspire learning and personal growth. The vandalism investigation had revealed that the graffiti had been created by a group of students who had been inspired by art and social studies classes that had encouraged them to think about artistic expression as a form of social commentary. The students had not intended to damage school property, but had viewed the walls as canvases for communicating their ideas about peace, social justice, and personal freedom. The resolution of the case had involved extensive discussion between school officials, police, students, and parents about appropriate channels for artistic and political expression. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, the school had created a formal mural program that allowed students to create authorized artwork that could serve as permanent decorations for school facilities. Detective Martinez had observed that this photograph documented not just a specific incident, but also the broader social changes that were affecting the community during the 1960s. Students' graffiti had reflected new ideas about individual expression, social responsibility, and the role of young people in shaping their community's values and priorities. The color photographs that began appearing in the collection during the 1970s provided richer detail about crime scenes and evidence, but they also revealed how the community's physical appearance had been changing as new architectural styles, commercial developments, and lifestyle choices had altered the local landscape. Photograph 1974-0678D had documented a burglary at the new shopping center that had been built on the outskirts of town to serve the growing suburban population. The image showed the interior of an electronics store that had been targeted for its television sets, stereo equipment, and other consumer goods that had become increasingly popular during the 1970s. The photograph revealed a retail environment that was dramatically different from the Downtown stores that had dominated local commerce in earlier decades. The electronics store featured bright fluorescent lighting, colorful product displays, and marketing materials that emphasized brand names and technical specifications rather than personal relationships between merchants and customers. The burglary had been part of a series of similar incidents that had affected businesses throughout the shopping center, reflecting changing patterns of criminal activity that were adapting to new commercial environments and the types of merchandise that were available in suburban retail establishments. Detective Martinez had noted that this photograph documented not just criminal evidence, but also the transformation of the community's economic landscape as suburban development had begun to compete with traditional downtown businesses for customers and commercial activity. Investigation of the shopping center burglaries had required new approaches to security and crime prevention that addressed the challenges of protecting large retail establishments that operated with minimal staffing during evening hours. The cases had eventually been solved through coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and the implementation of improved security systems. Photograph 1978-0234E had captured the scene of a domestic disturbance that had occurred in one of the new apartment complexes that had been built to accommodate the community's changing housing needs. The image showed the interior of a modest apartment where a family argument had escalated to the point where police intervention had been necessary. The photograph revealed living conditions that reflected both the economic pressures and lifestyle changes that were affecting many families during the late 1970s. The apartment was furnished with a mix of new and second-hand items that suggested careful budgeting, and the personal belongings visible in the image indicated a family that was working to maintain stability despite financial constraints. The domestic disturbance had been resolved without criminal charges, but the incident had highlighted the social stresses that were affecting families who were adapting to economic changes and new patterns of employment, housing, and community life. Detective Martinez had observed that photographs from domestic disturbance calls often provided insights into how social and economic pressures were affecting family life in ways that were not immediately apparent from official statistics or public discussions of community issues. The photographic documentation from the 1980s reflected both advancing technology and increasing sophistication in crime scene investigation procedures. The department had begun using more systematic approaches to evidence photography that captured multiple angles, detailed close-ups, and comprehensive overviews of crime scenes. Photograph 1983-0567F had documented an extensive fraud investigation that had involved a local business owner who had been manipulating financial records to conceal embezzlement from his company's accounts. The image showed an office environment filled with filing cabinets, computer equipment, and stacks of documents that had been seized as evidence. The photograph had captured the transition period when businesses were beginning to adopt computer technology for record keeping while still maintaining extensive paper-based filing systems. The office environment shown in the image reflected the challenges that many businesses had faced in adapting to new technologies while maintaining familiar procedures and organizational methods that the fraud investigation had required extensive analysis of both paper documents and computer records, representing one of the early cases where the police department had needed to develop expertise in investigating computer-related crimes and evidence analysis. Detective Martinez had noted that this photograph documented not just criminal evidence, but also the technological changes that were beginning to transform how businesses operated and how criminal investigations needed to be conducted to address new types of fraudulent activity. Resolution of the fraud case had involved cooperation between local law enforcement, state investigators with specialized computer expertise, and federal agencies that were developing new approaches to investigating white-collar crimes that involved electronic record-keeping systems. Photograph 1987 to 0789G had shown the aftermath of a vandalism incident at the community center where unknown persons had broken several windows and damaged outdoor equipment during a weekend when the facility had been closed. The image had captured not just the immediate damage, but also the broader context of community, recreational facilities that had been developed to serve residents of all ages. The photograph had shown playground equipment, sports facilities, and landscaping that represented significant community investment in providing recreational opportunities that would promote healthy activities and social interaction among residents. The vandalism had been particularly troubling because it had targeted facilities that served vulnerable populations, including children's programs and services for elderly residents. The investigation had revealed that the vandalism had been committed by a group of teenagers who had been under the influence of alcohol and had made poor decisions during what had begun as harmless socializing. The incident had prompted community discussions about providing appropriate recreational opportunities for young people and addressing the underlying issues that sometimes led to destructive behavior. Detective Martinez had observed that photographs of vandalism incidents often revealed the community's investments in infrastructure and services that were intended to improve quality of life, making the damage particularly meaningful beyond its immediate cost and inconvenience. The color photographs from the 1990s had provided increasingly detailed documentation of crime scenes and evidence, but they had also captured the community's continued evolution as new technologies, demographic changes, and economic conditions had shaped local life. Photograph 1992 to 1234H had documented a burglary at one of the new computer stores that had opened to serve the community's growing interest in personal computer technology. The image had shown sophisticated electronic equipment, software displays, and technical manuals that reflected the rapid advancement of computer technology during the early 1990s. The burglary had been notable not just for the value of the stolen merchandise, but also for the technical knowledge that the perpetrators had demonstrated in selecting specific items that would be both valuable and easy to resell. The incident had highlighted the need for new approaches to investigating crimes that involved rapidly changing technology. Detective Martinez had noted that this photograph documented the community's adaptation to technological changes that were transforming both criminal opportunities and law enforcement challenges. The investigation had required consultation with technical experts and coordination with other agencies that were developing expertise in computer-related crimes. The photographic collection also included images that had been taken during community events and public safety activities that were not directly related to criminal investigations, but that provided important documentation of the police department's role in community life. Photograph 1995-0445I had captured a community safety fair where police officers had provided educational programs about crime prevention, traffic safety, and emergency preparedness. The image had shown families gathered around informational displays, children trying on police equipment, and officers engaged in friendly conversations with community members. The photograph had documented the police department's efforts to build positive relationships with residents through educational and outreach activities that went beyond traditional law enforcement functions. The community response shown in the image had reflected residents' appreciation for officers who made efforts to connect with them in non-enforcement contexts. Detective Martinez had observed that photographs from community events often provided the most positive documentation of police-community relationships. showing officers and residents working together to address shared concerns about safety and quality of life. These community photographs had been particularly valuable for department training and public relations activities, as they had illustrated successful examples of community policing that could serve as models for future initiatives and programs. The evidence room also contained photographs that had been taken during training exercises, equipment demonstrations, and facility improvements that had documented the police department's professional development and organizational evolution over the decades. Photograph 1997-0678J had shown a training session where officers had learned new techniques for investigating domestic violence cases, reflecting the department's commitment to improving its response to family-related crimes that required specialized knowledge and sensitivity. The image had captured officers engaged in role-playing exercises, reviewing legal procedures, and discussing case studies that had illustrated effective approaches to investigating complex family situations. The training had been part of a broader effort to ensure that officers had the skills and knowledge necessary to handle sensitive cases appropriately. Detective Martinez had noted that training photographs often provided important documentation of the department's professional development efforts and its commitment to maintaining high standards of service and competence in addressing community needs. The photographic collection had grown to include thousands of images that collectively provided a comprehensive visual history of the community and its law enforcement activities. Each photograph had originally been taken for specific investigative or administrative purposes, but the collection as a whole had become a valuable historical resource that documented social, economic, and cultural changes over several decades. Detective Martinez had often spent quiet moments in the evidence room reviewing photographs from different eras, observing how the community's appearance, lifestyle, and concerns had evolved over time. The images had provided insights into long-term trends and patterns that were not immediately apparent from individual cases or short-term observations. The photographs had also served as training tools that helped newer officers understand the community's history and the key types of situations that their predecessors had encountered. The visual documentation had provided context for current challenges and had illustrated successful approaches to problem solving that could be adapted to contemporary situations. As digital photography had begun to replace film-based systems during the late 1990s, the department had faced new challenges in maintaining and preserving photographic evidence while ensuring that important historical documentation would remain accessible to future generations of officers and researchers. The transition to digital photography had offered advantages in terms of storage, reproduction, and analysis capabilities, but it had also required new procedures for maintaining the integrity and authenticity of photographic evidence in legal proceedings. Detective Martinez had been involved in developing policies and procedures for digital evidence management that would ensure the continued reliability of photographic documentation while taking advantage of new technological capabilities that could improve investigation efficiency and effectiveness. The faded photographs from earlier decades would continue to provide valuable historical documentation even as new digital systems replaced older technologies. The images captured in these photographs represented moments in time that could never be recreated, preserving details about community life that would otherwise be lost to memory. In the quiet environment of the evidence room, surrounded by filing cabinets and storage containers that held decades of accumulated documentation, Detective Martinez understood that she was the custodian of more than just criminal evidence. The photographic collection represented a visual memory of the community that extended far beyond law enforcement activities to include the broader story of how people had lived, worked, and related to each other during periods of significant social and economic change. The photographs would continue to serve their original purpose as legal evidence when cases required historical documentation or when cold cases were reopened for additional investigation. But they would also continue to provide insights into community life that could inform current police work and help officers understand the long-term patterns and relationships that shaped contemporary law enforcement challenges. As the evidence room settled into its evening quiet, the thousands of photographs rested in their organized storage systems, each image holding within its borders a fragment of human experience that had been preserved for posterity. The faded colors and changing fashions visible in older photographs provided tangible evidence of the passage of time, while the consistent themes of human behavior and community life revealed the continuities that connected past and present in an unbroken chain of shared experience.